co-host right now, so it automatically turns after I leave for you to be
Okay,
the host.
perfect. All right, guys. So I'm pretty excited about this. It's a great time to kind of be thinking in terms of risk mitigation and all things around that for the business and for you as professionals. So Dr. Gleb is an internationally renowned thought leader in emotional and social intelligence, decision making, and risk management. He specializes in helping forward-looking leaders concerned about resistance to change. He serves as the CEO of the boutique consulting and training company Disaster Avoidance Experts. Its proprietary methodology transforms negative emotions and resistance around change into positive emotions and commitment by using narratives, nudges, and neuroscience. He's a best-selling author, having authored Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. And his newest book is published by Changemakers, is Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. His groundbreaking thought leadership has been featured in over 550 articles and 450 interviews in prominent venues. They include USA Today, Time, Fast Company, CBS, Fortune, CNBC, Inc. magazine, and many more. Actually, Dr. Gleb, I think you were in USA Today yesterday, as a matter of fact.
That's right. Yes. USA Today. That was my second interview in USA Today. Yes. Glad you caught that.
One of my members in the Wednesday group saw it. So pretty cool.
There you go. Thank you.
Dr. Gleb's expertise comes from over 20 years of consulting, coaching, and training. His clients include innovative startups, major nonprofits, and Fortune 500 companies ranging from Aflac to Xerox. His expertise also comes from his research background as a behavioral scientist with 15 years in academia, including 7 as a professor at Ohio State. He's published dozens of peer-reviewed articles, and in his free time, he makes sure to spend abundant quality time with his wife to avoid disasters in his personal life. So today we're going to explore how outstanding leaders, avoid decisions leading to people disasters. And my biggest risk today, I'm going to go in and out with the camera because I have to be walking. I had a hernia surgery last week. And if I sit too long, I swell up in places that you don't want to be swelling up. So if I go silent, I'm just walking my stitches off. So Dr. Gleb, the floor is yours. You call the breaks.
Excellent. Okay, great. Yes, so there will be one break. So the way the presentation will be structured is the first part of the presentation will talk about the kind of challenges we have with risk management and decision making. Why do folks make bad decisions around risks? Why do leaders make bad decisions around risks? And how do we handle all the risks that are facing us right now? Some of the risks that you stated, that you shared, from a business development to too much business, to handling government regulations, to handling employees retiring or onboarding new employees. All of those risks and many more. How do you handle these things? And why do leaders tend to make mistakes? And how can we avoid those mistakes? So that's the first part of the presentation, the kind of mistakes we make, so that you can recognize those mistakes. Of course, the assessment that you got in advance talks about those mistakes, and we'll go more in depth into the first part of the presentation before the break. Then just before the break, we'll have a discussion activity where you will discuss all of these topics and then report out. The second part of the presentation will be about specific techniques that you can use to address and mitigate those risks that are driven by behavioral science research, and then how can you implement those techniques in your organizations. So whether companies, nonprofits, all sorts of organizations, and again, there will be a discussion before the conclusion. So it's going to be the structure of the presentation, just so you know, foreshadowing. So how do leaders manage risks? How do you do that effectively in order to make the best decisions? I mean, leaders are decision makers, right? That's kind of synonymous. Unfortunately, leaders often don't make the right decisions, and business disasters are what result from bad decisions. My company is called Disaster Avoidance Experts because we care about helping leaders avoid business disasters. And by business disasters, we mean anything that seriously impacts your bottom line. And we specialize in resistance to change, but all sorts of business disasters, that's kind of the things that you want to avoid. Unfortunately, leaders all too often fall into situations and patterns of bad decision-making that result in business disasters. So there was an interesting behavioral science study of 423 US companies. And these are not simple mom and pop shops. These are huge companies, 500 plus million in assets that went bankrupt from 1981 to 2007. So that was before the 2008-2009 fiscal crisis, when many otherwise healthy companies went bankrupt due to market events. So this is during that period, 81 to 2007, 423 companies. And the study showed that 46% of these failures, so about half of these failures, resulted purely from bad strategic decision-making by the company leadership. That's all. Now, of the rest 54%, many of those could have been likely avoided by better decision-making and avoiding worse decision-making, but 46% of the failures were purely due to bad decision-making. I'll give an example. So if you remember a company called Polaroid, shake it like a Polaroid picture, right? I remember that when I was a kid, my parents taking pictures of me with a Polaroid. I don't know, maybe that ages me. But anyway, that's something that was a huge company, and it was making photographic films. Of course, it was very popular. And Polaroid, it was making a decision in the early 1990s, so during this period, about the fact that, well, more and more cameras were getting digital. Folks were getting more into digital cameras as opposed to photographic film, which was its business. And it was thinking, well, should we invest into digital cameras? Should we go into digital, or should we stick with the, shake it like a Polaroid picture, so physical film? And they looked at the profit margins. They conducted an in-depth study of profit margins. They found that if they switched to digital, their profit margins would go from their current 62%, which is great profit margins. That's what they had in their photographic film. They would go to around 30%. So they said, well, hey, these profit margins aren't acceptable. We're going to stick with digital. Unfortunately, they discovered that 62% of zero is still going to be zero, and they went bankrupt in 2001. And this is one of those companies, 423 companies. By contrast, consider Fujifilms. So Fuji was in kind of the same position. They had great profit margins on their photographic film. They understood that their profit margins would be about half of that on the digital cameras. But they realized that, hey, here's where the market is heading. And if we don't want to get left behind, we need to go with the market rather than our current profit margins. And so they decided to invest into digital. They squeezed as much as possible out of their photographic film, invested into digital, and they're still around right now, doing great, $6 billion company. So that's an example of a strategic decision-making blunder by Polaroid and a successful decision by Fuji in exactly the same position. Now, unfortunately, denying reality, as Polaroid did in looking clearly, kind of sticking its head in the sand, as the myth about the ostriches says, about digital cameras being more popular, is very common for top leaders. There's a study of 1,087 members of boards of directors, all sorts of organizations, that fired their CEOs. And what the study found is that 23% of them, so just about a fifth, over a fifth of them were fired for denying reality, simply denying reality. That means ignoring negative information about the future of the company. That's what led to them being fired. So that's pretty bad. And we see about half of all decisions that bankrupt companies come from bad strategic decision making. Many CEOs are fired for denying reality. Unfortunately, what folks don't realize is what is driving their decision-making and what is driving the decision-making of others that they're engaging with. Most decisions, if you look at the recent research, about 80 to 90% of our decision-making, when we just go with our intuitions, follow our heart, just go with what we know, go with how we naturally make decisions, they come from emotions. So this is something to really remember and understand. I'm going to repeat it again. They come from emotions. If we don't deeply understand our own emotional drivers as leaders, like I said, I'm CEO of a company, right? So I understand. So when I talk about leaders, I mean myself too. It can be pretty tough to make good decisions for me as well when I get into an emotional state and it's hard to recognize my own emotions. So it's really important to recognize your own emotions when your emotions are driving decisions. They really are very powerful. Anxiety, fear, anger, frustration, very powerful emotions. And of course, sometimes positive emotions, joy, ambition, and so on. So you want to understand that emotions drive most of our decisions when we do just what naturally comes to us without using evidence-based decision-making strategies, which we'll talk about in the second half of the presentation. Before we go on to talking about some of these cognitive biases, I want to take a little poll. Was there a time, so you'll be able to see the poll on your screen, it's a Zoom poll, and you'll be able to vote in the poll immediately. Was there a time when you were very confident about something and you turned out to be badly wrong, leading you to kind of doubt other areas where you might be right or wrong? I know it happened to me, and unfortunately more than once, that happened where I was pretty confident. One time I remember I was pretty confident about an employee, assistant manager who I hired, and she turned out to be not a very good assistant manager at all, creating a lot of problems and a lot of stress for the team. And yeah, did not work out, but I was really confident about her. So that's an example. So I see we have, great. So we have 10 people voting. Good. Excellent. We have everyone voting. So we see that that happened to all but one of you. So 91% of you, so 9 and 10 out of 11 that happened. So the one person who didn't. Great. I'm glad to hear that it didn't happen to you, but it happened to most people clearly. So this is a common experience that leaders have, unfortunately. Let's talk a little bit about these specific dangerous judgment errors. But before we talk about that, I want you to learn more about me so that you know who you're sharing the journey with for the next 3 hours or so. So about me, my experience, clients, media, and books. And Peter already talked about this. I'm just going to cover this briefly. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, consulting, coaching, and training, 20 years of helping clients in disaster avoidance of all sorts, risk management, decision-making, strategic planning, specializing in helping leaders concerned about resistance to change. And I spent 15 years in academia researching these topics, published in a bunch of peer-reviewed venues, behavior and social issues, Journal of Social and Political Psychology, so those prominent academic venues. My clients range from a whole Fortune 500 companies from Aflac to Xerox, innovative startups, major nonprofits, the World Wildlife Fund, the Columbus Foundation, and so on. And featured on a ton of various media venues, Inc., Time Magazine, CNBC, Newsweek, Scientific American, NPR, and so on. And finally, I published 4 well-known books: Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters; The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships. And that first one, Never Go With Your Gut, is about decision-making, risk management. So really, that's what the presentation is based on. The Blind Spots Between Us is a topic of emotional and social intelligence, effective communication, relationship building. The Truth Seeker's Handbook, science-based guide, is about how to address these dangerous judgment errors, how to see them within ourselves. And finally, Resilience, Adapt, and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, obviously published in response to the pandemic. Now, there's something that many of you might have wondered that a lot of people think when they first hear me speak. Not when they see me. I kind of have a normal, regular appearance, fitting into the mainstream. But when I speak, I obviously have an accent. So folks ask, where are you from? And I'll be happy to answer that. So from a small country called Moldova. It's in southeastern Europe, so you can see that on the map. It's so small that you need an arrow to point to it in order to see it. And I came from that country with my parents when I was 10 in 1991. I was pretty glad I was living in America. You know, my previous life in this country it was liberated from Soviet domination, which is why we were able to come here. That was not a great experience, but I was especially glad in 1996. So when I was 16 at the time, when I found out that Moldova, there was a world values survey, and was actually rated the least happy country in the world. So the least happy country in the world. I mean, I don't know why. I was 10 years old when I left, so I was still kind of really surrounded by my family environment, which wasn't that unhappy. But the whole country itself was pretty unhappy. I was glad that I left. And my parents ended up in New York City. So that's where I grew up. That's kind of home for me. And right now I live in Columbus, Ohio. But in New York City, that was a pretty, and it still is, a cultural melting hub, metropolis, lots of different accents, lots of different immigrants, mean, kind of like Washington, D.C., very much of a metropolis melting hub. And it didn't seem weird that I had a different accent. Now, many immigrants chose to drop their accents when they came to the United States, but my parents taught me to be proud of my cultural heritage, so I decided to keep my accent. Unfortunately, when I was getting my PhD and learning about these dangerous judgment errors, these cognitive biases that cause leaders and ordinary folks of all sorts to make bad decisions, I learned that keeping my accent was probably a pretty dumb idea, unfortunately, because of a phenomenon called accent discrimination. So, accent discrimination refers to the fact that people in the United States, kind of the mainstream approach to accents, just how people mostly perceive accents, is that those who don't have a mainstream American accent are perceived as less trustworthy, falsely so. I'm sure some of you with accents can understand what I mean. There's kind of a perception that, hey, you're not from around here, you're different, less trustworthy. And it's not conscious. You don't consciously think this. We don't consciously think this. It's a gut reaction. It's an intuition. It's a feeling that, there's something weird about this person. Something's off. That's a feeling. And that's one of the kinds of feelings that leads us into making bad decisions. And the broader principle here, the cognitive biases, dangerous judgment errors that we're going to talk about are called the halo effect and the horns effect. So two cognitive biases, the halo effect and the horns effect. The horns effect refers to kind of someone having little horns. It's when we don't like one characteristic of someone, like their accent or their appearance or their value sets, their ideology, their religion, them being from some kind of a place we don't like, maybe associated with the government and the regulations and so on, we will tend to dislike all of their other characteristics. That's just how it is. That's how we function as human beings. We like characteristics of others that are similar to ourselves, and we dislike characteristics of others that are different from ourselves. The halo effect is the opposite. If you like one characteristic of a person, you will tend to like them too much. You will tend to like all of their other characteristics and give them too much credit. Especially bad for business relationships. I'll give you a good example. So I was giving a presentation, a closing keynote, to a group of HR leaders in diversity and inclusion in Ohio, so Central Ohio, right here in Columbus, Ohio. Now, if there's one thing you know about Columbus, Ohio, you'll know that it's the home of the Ohio State Buckeyes, so go Bucks. And we have a storied rivalry with the University of Michigan Wolverines, one of the biggest rivalries in college football, if not the biggest rivalry. So imagine the scene. I'm giving this presentation, closing keynote, top HR leaders around the region, over 100 of them, and they've been sitting, hearing presentations on diversity inclusion, how to be more diverse, inclusive, so DEI and so on. And I'm looking at them, giving the presentation, talking about the halo effect and the horns effect. I say, hey, kind of, the University of Michigan, we know that there's some hostility to the University of Michigan perhaps in this room. So how many of you HR leaders would actually hire somebody from the University of Michigan? How many of you would hire them? Please raise your hands. And out of those over 100 people, you know how many raised their hands? 3. 3 people. I have this on video, so it's nice that I was getting this videotaped. So I have this on video of only 3 people raising their hands that they would hire somebody from the University of Michigan. Imagine that. Imagine kind of the power of that statement. Now, of course, whether they go to University of Michigan or Ohio State or the University of Delaware or anywhere else, or George Washington University, DC, that doesn't matter for their quality of their work, right? It's not the team that they root for. It's about their credentials, about their ability, it's about their experience. That is what's crucial for their work. But unfortunately, the team spirit, the liking and disliking of their background, the trait we share or we don't share, that we oppose, in this case, the horns effect, causes people to make really bad decisions around hiring. And of course, promotion, all sorts of business relationships. So I know a couple of people here are thinking about hiring, and that's something to really be thinking about. But all sorts of business relationships, as you're developing business relationships, are strongly influenced by the halo effect and the horns effect, including within companies. I've seen so many times when there are serious tensions between, let's say, operations and sales, or between marketing and sales, or HR and operations, or legal and everyone else. It's a very common phenomenon, and the same thing happens within companies. We speak about the benefits of teamwork, and there's definitely benefits to teams, but often teams within departments, the whole department feels itself to be part of a team, and it's a rival of a team that's another department. And that creates a lot of problems and hostilities within organizations due to this internal halo effect, focus on a department team, and external horns effect toward another department. So I want you to take 30 seconds right now to just write down somewhere on your computer or notepad what kind of horns effects and halo effects issues might there be in your company. And we'll be discussing this, break up into groups and discussing this in the activity close to the break. So keep that in mind as you write down. So just take 30 seconds to write that down. Please go ahead. I see Scott chatted that it's true of the IT help desks from India or elsewhere, or those from the South who speak slower than others. Definitely, I've seen that with the South. There's a sense of negativity toward folks from the South, from mainstream American appearance, from mainstream American cultural contexts. All right, so now that you've had time to think about that and write it down, take a look. We'll do another poll. And I want to ask you, in your workplace, so where you work, how problematic is the halo effect and the horns effect? Either of these, are they not a problem? Are they moderate problem? Or are they serious problem? So I know Scott was talking about that being kind of a pretty problematic issue. So please go ahead. Vote. Not a problem, moderate problem, or a serious problem. See, 10 of 11 voted. Great. Okay, excellent. Everyone voted. Perfect. Okay, great. So we see that just for over a third of you, it's not a problem. So great. So that's not an issue for you. Wonderful. Great to hear that. But for most of you, about 2/3, it's a problem. Moderate problem, not a serious problem, but it's a moderate problem. So I'm glad that you're realizing that, and we'll be discussing that in the discussion as we go ahead. We'll be taking questions. I'll be taking questions before and after the discussion. Great. So let's talk a little bit about the broader framework. I already talked a little bit about emotions and the kind of the studies there. Why does this happen to us? Why do we make bad decisions when we just go with what we feel, what we know, what's natural to us? Gurus, everyone from Malcolm Gladwell, who says blink, or Tony Robbins, who says be primal, be natural. They say go with your gut, trust your intuition, follow your heart. Fortunately, though, recent research shows that this advice is very badly off. Our gut feels very comfortable. By definition, that's our gut. That's our intuition. Going against it is very counterintuitive. But it often leads to disasters, just like some of the decision-making about not hiring Michigan fans, and many, many other decisions that lead to tensions within organizations between different departments. Our gut, our intuition, that's what the research shows, is actually evolved for the ancient savannah, not the modern world, when we lived in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people. So we had to be very tribal. We had to be very directed, very oriented to our tribe, as we were hunter-gatherers living in those small tribes. And as part of our tribalism, we had to very much support people in our tribe. That's where the halo effect comes from. We have to, in that environment, look for people who share our characteristics, who are part of our tribe, like them, support them, be loyal to them. And the horns effect is the opposite of that. We have to fight those who are hostile because they were not members of our tribe. Now, if we weren't sufficiently tribal, we get kicked out of our tribe, and then we die. So notice we're the descendants of those who didn't die. And if we weren't sufficiently hostile to members of other tribes, we wouldn't be willing to fight them off and oppose them. And again, they conquer our tribe and then we die. And again, we're the descendants of those who didn't die. We're the descendants of those who had a very strong, that kind of halo effect and horns effect, who are very strongly tribal. And that's why the halo and horns effect are two of our biggest problems when we make decisions and manage risks around other people. So when you're thinking about the transition for letting those two members of your team go, or bringing on other members, other team members, staffing up, dealing with those managers who one of the group members mentioned, horns effects and halo effects are very, very prevalent in the kinds of decisions we make. The broader pattern here is dangerous judgment errors. That's what the assessment was about, and we'll get to the assessment a little later. These are called cognitive biases. Now, the research on this topic, if you want to learn more about the research, by the way, you'll have an option to get the assessment and the books, 2 of my books for free, digital copies of the books. I'll tell you how at the end of the presentation. So this is something, these describe cognitive biases in much more detail. These dangerous judgment errors that we tend to make because of how our brain is wired. And the cognitive biases are the specific irrationalities, specific ways that we go wrong when our gut tells us to do something that actually opposes what we need to do in the modern environment. Because as you notice, the modern environment is very not tribal. We function in complex organizations. We function in a global world that's very much not aligned with just looking for people who are like us, being in a tribe. So our gut reactions, our tribal gut reactions, are very much not aligned. They're very opposed to working in complex modern organizations, which involve working with very diverse people and in a global context. So that's really a major issue that you want to be thinking about. And so there's a combination of 2 things here, the dangerous judgment errors, the evolutionary background, and I talked about the halo and horns effect. I'll get to another important aspect of our evolutionary background, and then how our brains are wired. So specifically the structure of our brain. My books talk quite a bit more about the structure of our brain, evolutionary background. You'll get them. So I'm not going to go into them here unless you ask me in the Q&A. So if you want, happy to talk about that. The other thing, so we talked about the halo and horns effect. That's one thing to really keep in mind as you're going for the day and as you're seeing how those who are in your companies and your organizations, nonprofits, behave. The halo and horns effect is very powerful. And the tribalism, more broadly, tribalism is very powerful. The other thing that's very powerful that we don't tend to notice is called the fight or flight response. The fight or flight response was incredibly important for helping our ancestors, the hunter-gatherers, survive. Again, we're the descendants of those who survived, who had a very strong fight or flight response, who were able to get away from the risks that were immediate, intense, in the moment. Saber-toothed tigers. You might have heard of this as the saber-toothed tiger response, where we have to get away from, jump away from 100 shadows to get away successfully from a saber-toothed tiger. So we tend to very strongly overreact to risks in the modern world that feel like they're immediate, intense in the moment. Things like competitive risks, where we're looking for how do we deal with competition? How do we deal with these sorts of things? With government regulations, with maybe that DoD issue or the cybersecurity issue. How do we deal with those sorts of challenges? They feel very risky, and we tend to make bad decisions around them. It's very dangerous in today's world because the kind of risks we face are very different from those immediate, intense, and in the moment risks that we faced in the savannah environment. We face risks that are long-term, that are uncertain, that are ambiguous. They might come from a notification on our smartphone about an email we get with some new regulations from the government, or some information about the housing market and how that will impact lumber prices, or maybe some disease that's starting up in the middle of nowhere, China. That's kind of risks that we face in the modern world, and we make bad decisions about them. So that's kind of the framework that I want you to keep in mind, the tribalism and the fight or flight response that very powerfully impact us. that we don't notice, that we have to learn how to notice these emotions, these intuitions, which greatly shape our decision-making and cause us to make bad decisions in the face of modern risks and modern people. So we talked about the Hale and Horns effect, and the cognitive biases are the specific ways. So you want to learn about these cognitive biases because there's the specific ways that tribalism, fight or flight, and other broader patterns within our mind that come from our evolutionary background and brain structure, that's how they manifest. The halo effect and the Horns effect, so you want to learn about them. The other, I'll talk about two others, and of course you'll learn about more in the books and the assessment. The confirmation bias is a really important one. If you've heard about cognitive biases at all, you've probably heard about this one. It's pretty popular. Our instinct is to see the world through rose-colored glasses. So that's our intuition. That's how we feel. That's the right thing. That is something that is really challenging and really problematic for us. So we see the world through rose-colored glasses, and we see the world as we want it to be, not as how it actually is. So we search for information that confirms our beliefs, and then we reject information that doesn't go along with our beliefs. That's a big problem. And that's really something that impacts so many folks, including a lot of Vistage members. So I'll tell you about a story from a Vistage member from a presentation I gave about 2 years ago. And that presentation was in Northeast Ohio. So Northeast Ohio was giving a presentation, and I started talking about the confirmation bias, and then had people write down, which I'll have you write down, any instances of confirmation bias in their company. And then one of the people who was in the presentation was a Vistage member for about 5 years. And he shared a story that actually none of the people in Vistage heard before about one of the, probably the main reason he said that he actually came to Vistage. So he runs a company of about 110 people, manufacturing company, so small, mid-size manufacturing company, heavy equipment, heavy manufacturing equipment. And he established it in 1970, if you can believe that, still runs it. So it was as of 2 years ago. Well, I've been in contact with him 3 months ago, so he's still doing fine. And in 1979, he hired someone, salesman, who became his right-hand man. So became the VP of sales, super important, really, really critical person in the company. And so that was about 4 years ago before he came to Vistage. And so 4 years ago, before he came to Vistage, that's when the story started. So what he found was that the sales were starting to kind of slip. There were issues. So that was a challenge. And then he determined that, hey, what's going on? He called in his sales VP, and the sales VP said, hey, I'm sorry, everything will be fine. We're doing some change management, some transitions in the sales department. Everything will straighten out. And what he thought was, okay, this is fine. I trust this guy. He's been with me since 1979 that was by then over 30 years. And so, yeah, everything will be fine. Well, what happened about 9 months later is that the sales VP suddenly quit and went to work for a competitor, a larger company, taking a number of valuable clients, existing clients, as well as prospects with him when he quit. So that was a huge, huge problem for the company. And the company, the CEO was dumbfounded, shocked, astonished. He couldn't believe it. So he naturally went looking for what was wrong, what was the situation. And he investigated, had his people investigate. And what he found was that the sales VP, his right-hand man, who was 9 months ago, well, it was 10 months before the incident, there was a search for a COO of the company. So this new COO. And the sales VP naturally thought that he would be the COO, perhaps a little bit arrogantly and overconfidently. And the CEO decided that it was time to inject some fresh blood into the company, want somebody with not simply a long time experience in the company, but somebody with a more high quality education, MBA, so on, as he transitions his family company, he eventually wanted within a 5-year span to transition it to his son. And he wanted to hire a COO who would stay with the son because he knew the sales VP would retire within a certain period of time, not too long after himself. So he wanted to hire a COO for his son. And he passed over the sales VP, and the sales VP was so pissed. He felt betrayed. He felt that this was really terrible decision by the CEO and that this is not worthy of him. So he decided to sabotage the company and make some money on the side and go work for a competitor. And so the competitor hired him, the sales VP, as the COO with a number of clients that he took with him. And even before that, well, the reason the sales started to slip is that he was giving information about prospects to the competitor. So it was already starting 9 months before that. So that was pretty terrible. And that was really, really bad situation. It took the CEO, he said it took him about 5 years to recover, and about 2 years into the recovery process, he decided he needed some external perspective, some outside input, and he started looking for where he can get that, and he decided to join Vistage as a way of getting that external impact and input. So his chair knew about the story, but none of the other Vistage members knew about the story. So that's an example of how confirmation bias is really, really bad within a company, and specifically a Vistage company. And so that's something I wanted to share. And now I want you to take 30 seconds to write down where confirmation bias might be impacting your organization. So please take 30 seconds to write that down. And again, we'll be discussing this in the exercise. Scott, we'll talk about the going with your gut. Ask that in the Q&A. I want to make sure we discuss this. So that's a really important question, but I don't want to get into it right now. It's a little bit of a longer discussion, and I want to have it with folks rather than just simply answering, which would be easy, but not in-depth enough for this important question. So please do bring that up. And for those of you who are not aware, Scott is chatting to everyone, so you can see his comments in the chat. All right, so hopefully you've had time to write down some confirmation bias, and of course you can write that down more later. I want you to take a look at the poll. We'll do the same sort of polling that was before, so you'll be familiar with it in your workplace, in your company, in your nonprofit. How problematic is the confirmation bias? Not at all a problem, a moderate problem, or a serious problem. Please go ahead and vote. Great. Okay, so let's take a look at the results. So for about a quarter of you, it's not a problem. But of course, that means that for 3/4 of you, it's a problem. So it's good that you realize that and that you understand that. So that is an important issue to understand. So it's a little bit more of a problem than the halo and horns effect was. So that was about problem for about 2/3 of you. This is a problem for about 3/4 of you. So you want to realize this is a problem in your company. We'll talk about how to address these sorts of things later, but the main thing is to understand and evaluate where it's a problem, which we'll do the exercise to do that. Excellent. Okay, let's go on. The last cognitive bias I want to get to in a little bit more depth is called the normalcy bias. The normalcy bias. Now, in the Savannah environment, it was important for us to be oriented toward the moment, where we are right now, because that's kind of the life we had in the Savannah environment. You know, if we killed a mammoth, we couldn't store the meat, so we needed to eat as much of it as possible when we killed a mammoth, stuff our bellies, and because pretty soon the meat would rot. I mean, now we can put it in the refrigerator, but of course, we're not killing mammoths nowadays. but you can store your money in a bank. You can orient toward improving your career by taking professional development courses or getting coaching in Vistage and getting the external consultants for the CRM if you want to improve your company. So all of those sorts of things. And of course, doing the strategic planning to improve your company. So that's what we talked about as well. So there are various ways of investing into the long term because our world is much more stable and has a much more of a long-term orientation than what we used to have. But the normalcy bias, unfortunately, we tend to perceive that the future will be much like the past. We assume that everything will keep going normally and that the future will just be very similar aspect of the past, that the current trend lines will continue. That is a bad assumption in the modern world. That's not something that we should safely at all assume in the modern world because we underestimate the kind of problems, the kind of issues that result from major disruptors. And there are tons of major disruptors in the modern world. Now think about the rise of the smartphone. A couple of you work in app companies or software as a service companies that are enabled by broadband, that are enabled by a smartphone. Those things weren't really around 20 years ago. That's not something that we could have had as a possibility, or cybersecurity companies. That's a major disruptor that really changed. I remember when I didn't have a smartphone. I used to be when I didn't have a dumb phone. So I'm still of that age, and that's something that kids nowadays would really not understand, not be aware of that. So that wouldn't be part of their mentality. Of course, there are other major disruptors besides technology disruptors. There is the 2008-2009 fiscal crisis, which is a huge disruptor. And of course, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I said earlier about a disease that started in the middle of nowhere, China. Well, it really wasn't nowhere, China. In Wuhan, China, when people heard about this, the virus starting in Wuhan, the large majority of the population just said, well, what is this? This is kind of, this will just be like SARS or, the Asian flu. This is not a problem at all, not a big deal, just ignore it, whatever, nothing to worry about. But as a risk management expert, naturally I took an in-depth look at the situation because it's pretty concerning when the public health infrastructure of a city collapses that quickly as Wuhan did. And so what I discovered about Wuhan, something I didn't really know before, is it's a huge city. It's a major metropolis. It's called the Chicago of China. It has 11 million people. It produces over $22 billion in revenue per year. It has something like 500 international flights a day, which an average of 200 people per flight, that's 10,000 people coming into Wuhan every day and out of Wuhan every day around the world. So given that this is, and of course it has quite well developed medical system. So, there's many things that communist style countries don't do right. But public health is one of the things that they do reasonably okay. And of course, China is not like the old Soviet Union, the style system. It's capitalism as well. So their public health system is actually pretty good. And for the public health system to collapse that quickly was a major, major, major red flag. So I started warning my clients about this. I started talking about this already in January and February, saying, this is not nowhere China. This is like Chicago, China. For this city to collapse, imagine if this happened in Chicago and we had this major collapse of the public health infrastructure. You got to take steps right now to address this problem. You really need to be wary of this. And that's how I ended up writing a book. And that's why I'm featured in the USA Today talking about COVID. That's what Pete was talking about. So because I became known as an expert on this topic and managing risks around COVID effectively. So you want to be aware of things that are uncertain risks, that are major disruptors. So many companies were caught flat-footed by the pandemic, and there was such major disruption for a lot of Vistage members. I had to drag some of my clients kicking and screaming, the risk management clients who are on retainer, who I regularly give advice to, saying that this is a very serious issue. You got to make steps right now. The typical business continuity plan is not going to cut it. Business continuity plans, I'm sure you have one, but they're usually for a 1 to 2 week interruption. It's kind of like when Washington was hit by the hurricane or when there's a major blizzard. That's great for the typical emergency but that's a sprint. That's a 1 to 2 week interruption. COVID is a marathon. It's going to be many, many months of interruptions. When you need to go remote, when you need to shut your doors, there'll be many restrictions and shutdowns, and manage to track most of them kicking and screaming into having an appropriate business continuity plan addressing COVID. But that's not what happened to most companies, including most Vistage member companies. So this is an example of where a major, major disruptor catches a lot of companies flat-footed. I want you to take a minute, no, I'm sorry, 30 seconds, so we'll have 30 seconds, and write down where the normalcy bias might be impacting your company, where there might still be a presumption, where there was, of course, and where there might still be a presumption that the current trend lines will continue and that a major disruptor of any sort won't hit. Like, for example, there's a mystery disease that you might have seen in the headlines that's arisen in a very populous region of India. We don't know what's causing it. We don't know what's up there. Hopefully, cross fingers, not anything at all like COVID. And I've seen it. I've not seen enough information about it to say that it's at all anything going to be any serious issue. But I'm giving an example of something that's been in the news recently. So please go ahead, 30 seconds. Yeah, like Anne-Marie said, we all planned and God left. Well, we can fortunately learn how to change our plans in a timely manner. And unfortunately, from what I've observed, the large majority of companies didn't change their plans in a timely manner and were caught kind of flat-footed when they had to very suddenly transition. All right. So let's take a look. So that's going to be all. Of course, we'll discuss this in more depth. Same poll. In your workplace, how problematic is the normalcy bias? How problematic is the normalcy bias in your workplace? So assumptions that current trend lines will continue, not preparing enough for major disruptors that might come. Of course, not COVID-19, but other disruptions. 9 out of 10 voted, so one more person. Didn't vote yet, please go ahead. Give you 3 more seconds.
For some reason, I don't have the quiz here. I can't, it didn't prompt me. It didn't prompt my screen to vote for some reason.
That's weird. What would you vote for? Just let me know.
Probably moderate.
Moderate, thank you. Okay, so this is interesting. We have a situation that will be about, with you counting Yulia, about half of you don't see it as a problem for your organization. That's wonderful. So glad to hear that. And about half of you see it as a problem. And then for most of you who see it as a problem, it's a moderate problem. But this is the only kind of serious problem vote that we had among problems. So it's good to know that, and it's good to understand that. And of course, there will be certain steps that you can take to address the situation. Great. All right. So I'll talk about the assessment that you all went through now, which is a way of learning more about these cognitive biases. And perhaps not all of you looked in depth into the assessment. And so we'll talk about this and how you do the assessment effectively in your company, for yourself and your company. So how can we overcome these dangerous judgment errors? The first step with the assessment is to knowing about them. You need to go against your intuitions. First of all, it's uncomfortable to look at our own dangerous judgment errors, to look at ourselves and say, hey, this is a problem for me. This is a problem for my company. It's a problem for my organization. It's not a comfortable thing at all. You need to overcome this intuition. You need to overcome this feeling that your gut is right, that you are right, that whatever feels comfortable is true. And you know what? You already overcome it in a number of areas. Our intuitions were great for those humans, early humans that survived, our ancestors. The tribalism, the fight or flight response, that's wonderful. But in the modern world, that's bad for more complex decisions. For example, think about how you approach your eating. It's very simple in a way what you eat, but it's also very complex because of the abundance of modern processed foods. Modern processed foods, I mean, imagine coming into work and seeing a box of donuts on the break room table, open box of donuts brought in for everyone. And perhaps a client sent it as a thank you gift. So you see the box of donuts and it's pretty tempting. So decide, well, I'll take half of that delicious chocolate glazed donut. And then, well, there's half a donut left. You don't want to leave that. So you take the other half of the donut. And then you're kind of triggered by sugar. So you take another donut and then a third donut. And before you know it, half the box is gone. Not that it ever happened to me. Or perhaps, your choice of delicious poison is ice cream. So when you have half a carton of ice cream, did you know that a serving of ice cream is half a cup? Half a cup, that's kind of tiny. I don't know. How's that a serving of ice cream? I can't take half a cup of ice cream when I take ice cream. I don't know anyone who can, but maybe you're a better person than I am. That's very difficult. So you need to instead develop more healthy eating habits in the modern world in order to not fall into obesity and other serious diabetes health problems that come from this risky modern eating. And you can skip by those open, delicious glazed donuts and go for the healthy bowl of fruit that another client said. That's a much better choice for your health. It's sweet, tasty, but not nearly as triggering as sugar. Now, sugar is triggering because in the savanna environment, when we were hunters and gatherers and foragers, it was very important for us to eat as much sugar as possible when we came across it. So let's say we came across some honey. It was very important for us to eat as much of it as possible, stuff our bellies, because that's what enabled us to survive and thrive. We're the descendants of those who did so. In the modern world, that's really bad, and we are problematically triggered by sugar. So you've probably figured out some strategies to have healthy eating decisions for the sake of your physical health. Similarly, you need to apply, and it's a difficult thing. It's kind of for many folks, it's a lifelong struggle. And so you need to apply the same sort of mentality. How much effort did it take you to develop healthy eating habits and perhaps maintain them right now in the face of kind of pretty challenging circumstances with all the modern processed foods? You need to apply the same principles to develop healthy mental habits around decision making, to address this intuition, this gut reaction to eat all those donuts and all that ice cream and not go for the healthy desserts. You need to make healthy decisions, not unhealthy ones, not ones that go with your gut and follow along with your intuitions. And the assessment on dangerous judgment errors in the workplace that Pete sent out to you is really good for that because it helps you identify those dangerous judgment errors, those cognitive biases, specifically the behaviors associated with them. It doesn't say, halo effect and horns effect. It talks about behaviors. It focuses on the 30 most dangerous cognitive biases for professional settings. Now, if you want to look at all cognitive biases, you can take a look at the list of cognitive biases in Wikipedia. There's going to be over 100 of them. Not all of them will be relevant to professional settings. So the cognitive biases that are most relevant, pick them out. They're going to be in the assessment. And you will learn more about them in the book if you choose to get it. It evaluates the extent of these cognitive biases and their impact on your workplace and provides you with the next steps for addressing them. So let's take a look at it. And I want you to, what we'll be using right now is the chat function that Scott has been using and Anne-Marie has been using. So thank you for using that. So be prepared to use the chat function. You should be right now able to see the assessment on my screen. And the directions should be right in front of you. So each of these questions for the assessment that refers to a problem that might occur in your professional situations. It's about behaviors. It's something that you can immediately spot that anyone can do. You don't need anything complex. You don't need to know anything about confirmation bias or halo and horns effect to do the assessment. The answer for each question will be in percentage terms. So percent, how many percent? As a percentage of all the times that it could have occurred in the last year. So if you're doing it with a focus on a specific organizational department, team, or group, you can apply your evaluation to that unit or more broadly to your workplace or to yourself as an individual. You want to go with your initial impression. It'll most likely be the correct one. Don't overthink and don't fall into analysis paralysis. Each question should take you 10 to 15 to 20 seconds. So, and again, we'll be using the chat. So take a look at the first question. Number 1. In your workplace, in your company, organization, what is the percent of projects that missed a deadline or went over budget in the last year? These are all questions about the last year. So in the last year, what percentage of projects missed a deadline or went over budget? Please go ahead. Type your answer into the chat. Please go ahead. 10%, 5%, 50%, 25%, 33%, so a third. 2%. Oh, that's impressively accurate. Specific. Go ahead. Other folks, please go ahead and share. 10%, 5%. Great. And you can still share, of course. So this refers to the planning fallacy. When we make plans, although, as one of you, I think Anne-Marie said in the chat, we make plans and God laughs. We tend to make plans that are quite optimistic. We see the future as being mostly a nice place, and we feel ourselves to be optimistic about ourselves, about our plans, because we're good people, good leaders, we make good plans, and therefore we feel intuitively that everything will go according to plan. We don't put in enough resources for problems, for risks of various sorts, as most companies didn't put enough plans and resources into addressing the pandemic. So this is called the planning fallacy, where we make bad plans. And when you're at the 2%, 5%, 10% level, it's not a big deal. When you're getting above into the 10 to 20% range, that span, it becomes more of a serious issue. When you're above 20%, that's definitely a serious issue, because then you're misdirecting your resources pretty seriously. You're thinking, okay, I'm going to finish this CRM project, and it takes many more resources than you anticipated in terms of time and money, and then you don't get to other important projects. Or you're starting this DoD project, and it turns out to be much more of a hassle and much more politically nuanced than you thought it would be. Or perhaps, helping those 2 workers retire and creating a number of negative feelings. So those are the kinds of things that we don't anticipate nearly enough. All right, number 2. So percentage of team conflicts. So out of all team conflicts that occur in your organization, which ones occurred because someone in the conflict overestimated the effectiveness of their communication skills and persuasiveness? Conflicts occur, obviously. It's natural. What percentage of them over the last year occurred because someone in the conflict overestimated the effectiveness of their skills in communication and persuasiveness? So please go ahead. So we have 10%, 10%, consistency. 0%. Oh, good communication skills there, 15%. Other folks, 20%, 0%, 80%. Thank you for that, Yulia. So it's good to see this, kind of range from 0% to 80%, and the previous one was, I think, 2% to 50%. Some companies have more of one problem, some companies have more of the other problem, and various other issues. So it's good to know and important to know what's happening in your company. All right. And that one is called the illusion of transparency. We tend to see ourselves as effective communicators. So the illusion of transparency refers to the illusion that our communication is effective. Now, often our communication is not nearly as effective as we want it to be. In this age of using Zoom, there's a lot of technical difficulties, and even in person, there's miscommunication by mishearing. Somebody mishears something. Maybe there's a pronunciation issue or an accent issue, or you're distracted by thinking about, what you're going to have for dinner this evening. So mishearing, not paying sufficient attention, that happens. And then the other thing that happens is that people interpret your words due to the confirmation bias and other cognitive biases through their own filters, not really realizing what's going on. interpreting it in a way that they want to interpret it. So when you're talking about, when you're trying to hint that maybe it's time to retire, maybe it's time to kind of transition for you to go, maybe they will not take that hint and not want to hear you. So that's kind of the kind of things that happen way too often. That's called the illusion of transparency. Number 3, of all significant decisions that occurred in your organization over the last year, in what percentage of cases was someone involved in the decision, anyone, overconfident about the decision? Overconfident about the decision, the quality of the decision. So what percentage of cases was someone overconfident about the decision? So we see 50%, 25%, 10%, 2%, 3%, 60%, 20%, 25%, 10%. So this seems to be a little bit more of a problem than the previous one. So this refers to a cognitive bias known as the overconfidence bias. We tend to be overconfident about the future, about the quality of our decisions, because we feel good about ourselves. We feel good about our gut intuitions. We feel good about where we're going and the kind of decisions that we're making. And we don't think enough about their consequences and all the problems and risks and how other people might interpret them differently. We don't gather enough information to make good decisions. That's a very, very frequent tendency, a very frequent problem, to not gather enough information to make really important decisions. All right, so I'll stop it there, and you got the assessment and you can take a more in-depth look at it later. I want you to take 30 seconds and think about the kind of benefit that it would have for your workplace, for your team to take the assessment, for your, let's say, your leadership team to take the assessment. So take 30 seconds to think about that and think about what kind of insights, the benefits that it would have, and what kind of insights you'd get. And please write that down. So take 30 seconds to write that down, please. All right. Now let's take a look at the poll. This will be another poll about the assessment this time. How much value do you see in your team, whether it's your leadership team, all the employees in your organization, or specifically the department you lead, whatever, taking the assessment on dangerous judgment errors in the workplace and then discussing it, making some realizations about themselves, about their organization based on this? All right, I see 8 out of 10 voted, 10 out of 10 voted, great. So let's end the polling. Okay, so we see that just under a third of you see low value, so don't need to worry about it, don't need to do that. And the rest of you do see value in it. Excellent. So you see moderate value or high value in it. So you want to be thinking about whether you see, if you see high value in it, you want to be thinking about in the short term, bringing that to your organization. And if you see moderate value in it, that's kind of a little bit more in the moderate term. Next, maybe take it yourself, go through it in depth, and then make sure to use it for your team. So the assessment, once you get it, you'll see that it has next steps for each of the cognitive biases. So you'll determine the specific problems and then specific next steps for you to address them. So it has not simply assessing them, but next steps for addressing them, looking at their impact and addressing them. Now, this is the end of the first part of the presentation. I'll take questions right now before we break up into groups and talk about, have the discussions. So please go ahead. You can either unmute yourself if you wish to ask questions that way, or if you're more comfortable using the chat, please use the chat.
I have a question. In going through the survey, there were some I debated different answers. I mean, some of them I could rate 100%, And if I looked at it a different way, I go, it's a very different number. It's a 5 or 10% type number. But almost all the conflicts, I mean, no one sets about to do something wrong.
Yep.
But I think everyone believes that they're doing right. They don't always, they may not be correct in all the facts, but they're not purposely trying to do bad.
You're absolutely right, Paul.
So yes, we're all overconfident in our ability and overconfident in our ability to communicate. But when there's a communication breakdown, we don't understand whether the listener failed to listen or the communicator failed to communicate. Someplace, somehow, somewhere, someone didn't have the same understanding as the other person.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the source of conflict.
Absolutely. And all of these questions are never about maliciousness. The presumption, of course, is always of innocence, right? That, I mean, there's certainly, of course, there's politics. Of course, there's kind of internal conflict that it's malicious and someone can deliberately do that. But the vast majority of the cases, it's not. The vast majority of the cases, it's out of ignorance, like you're saying. Either the listener failed to listen sufficiently or the communicator failed to communicate effectively, or both. You definitely, whenever there's a different way of looking at it, you want to look at the way that reveals the most problems, because the point is to answer the problems. It's not like, you know, hey, I can look at this in the more positive light and then everything will be great. The point is to identify which of these issues is more problematic in your organization so you can take next steps to address them. So you can help the communicator learn how to communicate effectively. You know, there's great professional development on how to communicate effectively. You can help the listener listen effectively. There's great professional development on listening actively. And there's a lot of information about these. The point of professional development in the first place, I mean, why are you in Vistage? If your decision-making was wonderful and effective and perfect in the first place, right? You're in Vistage and there's professional development. There's, you know, communication folks who get tons and tons of money, and there's active listening folks who get tons and tons of money, and books and so on, because our intuitions about this are wrong, are flat out wrong, are bad, or for many of us, they're bad. So you don't want to, when there's a communication breakdown, you definitely want to get to the root causes. You don't want to say, well, you know, somebody didn't communicate. It's kind of about asking the question of what happened, why did it happen? Was there an ineffective communication? Not to blame the person who communicated, but to say, okay, can you be coached in more effective communication? Is there some aspect of your communication that's not effective? So for example, you know, how many people write emails that are too long and dense? Many people, many people write emails that are too long and dense. And they don't realize that many folks who get the emails are only going to look at the, you know, the first kind of couple of lines or something like that. So you want to, that's only one example. Or for active listening, for people who are not really actively listening to what the other person is saying, they're only preparing to speak. How many of us tend to do that if we're not taught how to actively listen? That's a skill. Those are all skills. And you want to learn about which of these are problems in your organization and how to address them.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. All right, I know there was a question in the chat. Okay. So Scott first says, working all remote adds communication. Absolutely. There's specific professional development in remote communication because there's a lot of nuance in remote communication that's not there in person, because you're losing body language, you're losing a lot of stuff that you're not seeing, that, you know, you're just seeing a little person icon on a screen, right? So this is one of the reasons I'm using this different style of communication, not kind of icon on the screen, so you can see more of me and that you can see my body language. There's a lot of body language and nuance and tone that's lost in communication. Of course, it's even worse in textual communication. Now, Scott asks, is there time and place to go with your gut when the objective criteria are not clear? So let me talk about when there's a time and place to go with your gut. There's something called expert intuition. And you've probably heard the idea that you need about 10,000 hours in an activity to get mastery. That's relatively accurate for mastery. You don't need 10,000 hours to do an activity to you don't need to be a master in everything, but you need to have a lot of experience with a certain topic where you get immediate feedback on whether you're wrong or you're right, in order to develop a sense that, hey, I can quickly make a decision and I can trust my intuition. Now, all of this stuff that I'm talking about, it's not about slamming your gut and saying that your intuition is bad. It's about learning when it's going to lead us in the wrong direction. So you already learned in regard to your eating. That's why I was using the example. The vast majority of you learned in regard to your eating that your health will lead you in the wrong direction if you just eat in a natural way, in your habitual way. So you've learned how to change those habits. And now you can trust your natural way, the learned. It's not natural, it's learned. There's a difference between that Tony Robbins primal savage way and learned civilized behaviors, which is what you actually need in the modern world. And Tony Robbins is really wrong about that. He's right about many other things, but the primal savage is wrong. It just feeds, kind of our desire to be right. So you need to learn where in business you make bad decisions and where those are the dangerous judgment errors in areas where you have a lot of experience. So for example, if you're responsible for profit and loss, which all of you are, you're probably able to look at a P&L statement and very quickly say, how's the division doing? How's the department doing? What's up with that? So something like that, you're able to quickly say that. That's not something that most of your employees can do because they are not experienced in P&L management. And so that's not something that you can trust their expertise on. But because you've seen many of these statements and you can get very quick reinforcement of it by seeing whether you made an accurate decision on whether the department is doing well or not by looking at actual, not simply top line numbers, but all the costs, going in depth into it, you can see what's actually going on. So that's something, or let's say something that pretty much all of your employees, most of them, let's say this, are good at is email management. So they've had a lot of experience with managing their email. They can pretty quickly say when something's spam or when something's bad. I mean, not all of your employees can do that. They can perhaps use some training in email management, but that's something that we in the modern world have a lot of experience with managing email. So that's an example of where you can trust your expertise. Now, so that's kind of where you can trust your expertise. When objectives are unclear, the time is to clarify the objectives. That is not the time to trust your intuition, because those types of decisions are very likely, are not types of decisions where you have a lot of expertise. For example, let's say you're deciding to hire someone at a top level position, manager or something like that, or you're deciding to do a merger, or you're deciding to open a new division, like the one that will deal with DoD. That is not a time when you have a lot of experience. How many times do we hire people for top level positions? How many times, like I screwed up with that assistant manager I hired? How many times do we do mergers and acquisitions? How many times do we open up a new division? Not often. So you want to make sure that for larger projects, for ones you don't, or ones you don't have experience with and you don't want to screw up, like let's say figuring out a new vendor for a new thing that's maybe not major, but you didn't do it often before, you want to make sure to go through a clear research-based, science-driven decision-making process, which I'll talk about in the next section. And then, yes, Scott says finding expert help like the CRM definitely helps. Oh, Gordon, yes, thank you. So yes, this is, I'm glad that the style of the presentation that I'm using, the video presentation software, helps. It's definitely a more modern way of presenting, more high degree way of presenting. Okay, great. So it seems the questions, I don't see any more questions. Oh, does anyone have any questions? You can unmute yourself or you can ask in the chat. All right, if not, then we will get into breakout rooms. So create 2 breakout rooms and you will see an option of joining a breakout room. So you'll need to click yes on your screen. And then you will discuss the things that you've written out for the first 3 cognitive biases and also realizations you made on looking at the assessment. On where cognitive biases, the question that you will discuss in the breakout room is where cognitive biases might be a problem for your organization. So again, where cognitive biases might be a problem for your organization. We'll have a 10-minute discussion and then get back and broader reporting out. After that, we'll have a break. All right, so you should be able to all see breakout rooms. So please go ahead into the discussion, and then we will report out.
always hate to lose any contract, but this particular contract was not profitable anyway. So it's not a hit to the bottom line. So that's 10 people, then 25 are going to the new, we're selling off to another company. So yeah, it's actually kind of exciting. I think I might be a little bored next year.
Right, folks, we'll be finishing up in about a minute, just letting you know. So just we'll keep going, but keep in mind that you'll want to wrap up in about a minute, and you'll see a clock ticking down in just a bit.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
For me, like a major problem, and historically in my decision making, is I'll overthink something. Like I'll go into analysis paralysis. And this, while like not trusting your gut sounds right, because you should use science and logic and all this kind of stuff, and not saying you should ignore that, but the idea of trying to put even more emphasis, at least as far as my personal decision making. Now I could see if you have like a company like where you have these big teams and you want to, enforce logical decision making, and that, yeah, you should have a structure behind it. But for me, as like the founder of a company, like I don't need any more structure. Like I need to make more decisions and do more things, like even if they're the wrong thing, So I kind of struggle with it. I just struggle with it a little bit. Not saying like, I can't say I disagree with anything he says. At the same time, I'm just not sure how much it applies.
So
anyway.
Brad, that's a really important point. And one of the cognitive biases you need to be aware of, and that sounds like you're falling into, and you'll see it in the assessment, is called the information bias, where we look at too much information before we make decisions. That sounds like what you're talking about. And the part of structured decision-making is deciding in advance how much information you need to make a decision. When you're looking for too much information and waiting too long, that's a bad decision. that's a bad aspect of decision. So the solution is not to go with your gut and trust your intuition. That's not at all the solution. The solution is to decide for each decision, how much information you actually need. If it's a small minor decision, then don't take much information. It's kind of minimal information. If it's a moderate decision, spend more time on gathering information. If it's a monumentally important decision, then spend a lot of time gathering the information. So that's kind of how you want to approach that sort of issue. And again, that's called information bias, and that's an assessment. Just want to let you know. Does that help, Brad?
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of pretty much what I already do. If it's a big decision, I'll spend a lot of time on it. I just have to make sure that, again, like I have, there's so many things that I need to make decisions on, and I will never have perfect information on all of them. So I just have to figure out where I take my shortcuts and where I spend more time.
And that's absolutely fine. I'll talk next about the technique to use for shortcuts, for quick decisions that we'll just take a couple of minutes to use. All right, we'll be finishing up in about a minute, and you'll see the clock counting down to our finishing up, just letting you know that. So just continue discussing, but yeah.
Bruce or Paul, I don't think, did you guys have something you wanted to add?
Just wait for everyone to finish up before we report out. All right, it looks like everyone's here. So want to hear from a couple of people about their experience, at least one from each breakout room, on their discussions and their insights as a result of the discussion and generally the first half of the presentation. Also, if you have any questions, I know there was a question from Brad I was able to answer. If you have any questions, please bring them up as well. So this is fine. This is the time for that.
I'm going to nominate Neil because I thought he made a really good point about something that he had to clarify to his employees. Is he with us? I can't see him.
Yep, I'm here.
Neil,
Sure.
would you be willing to share?
Yeah, absolutely. So interesting. In one of our sales meetings, I often ask our team, what do you really think differentiates us? Because I think I was telling you in the beginning, one of the risks I do see is all the the increased competitiveness.
Yeah.
And a couple of the folks responded, well, some of the competition, or if like Amazon gets into the space, they can only offer the vanilla and chocolate flavors, whereas we offer more the rocky road flavors. Those were literally the words. And I had to remind them because I think there's stuff that we sell that's off the shelf, straight commoditized product. And then there's things that we sell that are more specialty. We spend a lot of time on the specialty products, but the reality is that's only about 20% of our revenue. So us being this rocky road flavor, 20% of the time does not create a sustainable business.
Yeah.
And so I had to help them understand that, I'm glad you think that way, but at the same time, we have to understand where does the money actually come from? It comes from or a good chunk of it. What really helps us keep our lights on is the 80% of our business that's more commodity.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Neil. Appreciate that. That's really a great example. Thank you. I think we lost Neil for a second, so he'll come back. All right. Well, that's a great example and that's a great example of people making a mistake in their thinking. Okay, Neil, you're back. Great. So that's a great example of people making a mistake in their thinking, being overconfident. So falling a little bit into the overconfidence bias about their company and seeing themselves as special, seeing themselves as kind of, I'm confident about our specialty, spend a lot of time on this, and this is what we should be selling. Whereas that's not necessarily what 80% of your customers want. So that's kind of a matter of sales, training, of course, and just in general, getting people on the same page about how to present your company, sort of the company elevator pitch from a sales perspective. What is the company about? What is kind of the message that you want to send? And then specializing it for those folks, 20% of the folks who are interested in the rocky road. Thank you, Neil. Somebody else? An insight that you made from this presentation?
Hey, this is Jeff. I think in our group, we talked a lot about hiring and how we tend to use the halo and horns effect really impacts our hiring. And I know in our company, looking around at even the leadership team and then the second level down, it looks just like the rest of us. It's, we've kind of gotten to this trap where we just keep hiring almost clones of ourselves. So I think the leadership team needs to come together and kind of understand more about these halo and horn biases and how we can counteract that. Yeah.
That's really important. And that's an example, of course, of the story that I shared in the confirmation bias of, hiring from the outside and then the internal team being pissed. That's definitely an issue. It sounds like you know what I'm talking about, Jeff. That didn't happen, the consequences, but people being pissed about that. And that's something that's really important. We talk a lot about diversity of appearance, but there's in many ways even more important to have diversity of thought. So for example, one of the cognitive biases I didn't go into, but is called the optimism bias, where people are very optimistic about the future. They see the future as bright, they see the future as cheery. I'm very much of an optimist. I see the future as bright and cheery, and people who are founders, like many of you, will tend to be optimists as well. You'll see the future as bright and cheery. Now, imagine if my company was all full of, I like working with optimists. I don't like working with pessimists. Those are hard folks for me to work with because they kind of tend to poo-poo over all of my brilliant ideas. I have 20 ideas before breakfast and I think they're all brilliant. Now, imagine if all the folks in my company were also optimists. We'd have, 100 brilliant ideas before breakfast, and we'd be all reinforcing each other's ideas, and we'd be running in 100 different directions. That's a great way for a startup to burn out of cash before it actually succeeds, and for a company, even an established company, to be going in way too many directions. So I know, based on the research on this topic, that I needed to hire, and I did hire, pessimists who are going to look at my 20 brilliant ideas and say, well, you know, these are all half-baked potatoes, but maybe these 3 are worth finishing baking. And they take those 3 ideas, and the pessimists are terrible at generating ideas. You don't want them in a brainstorming meeting. When people say, do brainstorming, all team, that's very not what the research says. You don't want the whole team in a brainstorming meeting. You want to know who your optimists are. You want to put them in a brainstorming meeting. You don't want to subject your pessimists to that. You want to then give those ideas that the optimists generate, I generate, others, to the pessimists, and look at and have them go at these ideas. See which one of these ideas are the best ones, rank them, and pick top 1, 2, 3, depending on how many you want to focus. Pessimists are great at optimizing ideas. They're great at finding all the flaws of each idea and then addressing those flaws. So that's kind of only one. Optimism and pessimism is only one category of thought diversity that you want to have in your team. And there are many, many other aspects of diversity that you want to have in your team in terms of thinking. So thank you for bringing up that example. All right. Are there anyone else wants to share, or are there any other questions before we take a break?
Just a comment that one of the great things that I got out of this, out of Vistage, was that story that Pete shared with us, the Stockdale paradox, and that along with optimists and pessimists, you need realists, because in that story, the optimists didn't survive because they weren't based in reality and what their true situation was. So I think a sprinkling of not necessarily pessimists, but also realists is important, at least for where I am.
Mm-hmm. You definitely need pessimists as well as realists. So when you look at the research, the research shows that you'll want, in a general decision-making meeting, you want at least 2 people who act as a devil's advocate. You don't want one. Mm-hmm. When you're only hiring one person as devil's advocate, that person generally can't make their voice heard unless they're super loud, and then everybody else dislikes them and they leave the company anyway. So that is not a good situation generally for a devil's advocate. You want at least 2 pessimists on the team who will be looking at the ideas and saying, okay, this half-baked potato needs a number of corrections, and this one is rotten in the middle and doesn't work. So you definitely need those people. So yes, and realists as well, but you'll have a lot of people in the leadership position, top position, who are going to be very optimistic. Go ahead.
Do you recommend, when you're setting up a meeting to make a big decision, that you hand pick your 2 optimists, 2 pessimists, and then a realist? Because that makes sense to me.
Yes, you definitely want that. It depends on the nature of the meeting. If the meeting is to generate ideas, no, then you don't want pessimists. If the meeting is to evaluate ideas, you want more pessimists. If it's just kind of a general decision, so you want the function of the meeting should determine the kind of people you have in the room. If it's just kind of to evaluate and make a whole decision as a, more together, then yes, you want kind of a balance. But really depends on the function of the meeting in the decision-making process.
Great. The takeaway that I'm hearing from this is most of us on this call are probably more optimistic in our nature.
Founders.
And I know I fit into that category. And what's probably a good idea is, with any big decision I have to make going forward, go find somebody that's likely to find the flaws.
Yep.
And invite them to the conversation. And that's a nice takeaway for me.
Yeah,
absolutely.
You're destroying my next business idea, Pete. I'm going out this afternoon to hire pessimists that I can send out on 1099s to various companies. So it's rent a pessimist. Rent a pessimist.
Hey, Bruce, have you ever thought about that person just being you? I think that's you, right?
I'm a realist. I'm a realist. That's why I know where I need to find pessimists. That's why.
All right.
Oh boy.
If that's what you want to tell yourself, that's okay.
Okay, it sounds like it's time for a break. Okay.
I'm still in biases, but anyway, it's time for a break. So
yep. So 10 minutes. It's 9:55. So be back at 10:05.
Thank you.
starting back up in about a minute or so. Let's do your last minute things before we start.
I was just aware on the break that being the optimist that I am, even if I invited someone who would find the fault in my idea, my bias would want to minimize it to the point where I may even discount the best advice that I could possibly get on what's wrong with my idea. And, you know, and I can point out examples in my professional life where I actually did that to my own detriment. It cost me a lot of money.
That's an important insight, Pete. And one of the things that is helpful when you invite someone to give constructive criticism on your idea is to invite them not simply to point out what's wrong, but their suggestions for fixing it. That's, I think, because pessimists tend to have better ideas on how to fix things than optimists. And it gives optimists more hope and more positive feelings. Again, our emotions drive our decision making. So you want to not simply, if you can, you want to not simply have the pointing out of flaws, but also constructive ideas for, okay, these are some ideas for fixing the problem. And that will point you in the right direction, kind of orient you toward how to fix the problem. And that might help with the desire to discount the advice.
I mean, I did a back of a napkin assessment on what it really cost me. And I bet there's at least $1 million in decisions that I've made across the 30-year career that, you know, had they gone the other way or I'd not acted on them at all, I'd have that money in the bank right now.
Yeah, that's important insight. Okay, great. I think we're back. Let's see. Good. All right, so I hope everyone's back. Let's start up on the next section. So this section is about 2 strategies that you can use to fix these cognitive biases. One of the things that the groups were talking about, I know Brad was talking about how he has challenges with lots of decisions that he's facing and taking the time to make these decisions. You know, it seems like it would be tough to incorporate all this information. So this next technique is for just taking a couple of minutes on those daily decisions, not huge decisions, not, you know, the new strategy for your company or the new CRM or opening up the new department or kind of how to exactly to staff up, the broad kind of approach to staffing up. But how to write an important email to a client, let's say your government client with your cybersecurity firm who's about to do something screwy and you want to encourage them to not do that. Or perhaps some client who's about to buy a vanilla and chocolate, kind of the 80% thing that you're selling, where instead they should really buy the Rocky Road. And you know that they don't, and you need to persuade them to do it. So that's kind of an email to a client. There's so many other situations where you don't want to screw up, but you don't want to take a ton of time. The daily decisions that you make, you know, 5 to 10 times a day. And so here is a technique that'll take you a couple of minutes if the decision is completely correct. And believe me, if it's not correct, you definitely want to take the time, longer time to go thoroughly through this technique and fix the decision if you discover it's incorrect. But it's going to help you discover if the decision is good or needs improvement. 5 questions that you ask about those daily decisions, 5 to 10 to maybe more that you make a day. What important information didn't I yet fully consider? So when you're writing the email to the client, and you're trying to persuade them to do something, it's very tempting for us to not consider the information that the client wouldn't do what you want them to do, that they would go against your advice, your suggestions. And instead, it's very tempting to just state your point of view. However, an email would be much more effective if it addresses the client's objections and concerns in advance, their negative emotions, their anxiety, frustration, whatever emotions they're feeling that are blocking them from doing the right thing, because usually an emotional thing. So if you include in the email elements that address their concerns, it'll be a much more effective email and likelier to get them to do the right thing. Then what dangerous judgment errors didn't you yet fully consider? So what kind of cognitive biases might you be falling into? The confirmation bias, the planning fallacy, overconfidence, Halo and Horns effect, many others. Again, you'll get a book assessment going through this, but you want to be aware of what kind apply to each situation. Is this the situation which is a fight or flight response? That might be a situation where you just got some negative information about the company and you're feeling some concern, anxiety, anger, frustration, and you want to immediately make a decision. That is not a good time to make a decision. That is a good time to go for these 5 questions. You don't want to fall into the fight or flight response. Most optimists, by the way, folks like myself and most of you, will tend to have the fight response. That means aggressively responding to external situations, as opposed to the flight response, which is more characteristic of people who are pessimistic, which is withdrawing and ignoring the situation, or kind of not dealing with it in a timely manner, let's say it that way. So you'll want to be aware what's going on, or if it's a Halo and Horns effect, as we talked about hiring being a major issue. Jeff talked about how the company has an issue with hiring. That's kind of a Halo effect and a Horns effect. But if you're making a hiring decision, it's definitely a good time to go for this. Next, what would a trusted and objective advisor suggest I do? So Pete was just talking about how it would have been great. He would have saved something like $1 million if he had a trusted and objective advisor that was more pessimistically inclined and who he listened to made better decisions throughout his 30-year career. And that's something that you want to be thinking about. Who is your trusted and objective advisor? Of course, you have Pete here as your Vistage chair. You have members of the Vistage group. You have, I know, the CRM. You have the consultants who you brought in. You might have other folks who are trusted objective advisors. You want to think about what would they say about the situation. And what the research shows is about 50% of the benefit just comes from asking the question, not even asking the advisor, just asking the question, what would Pete do in this situation? What would Pete say, or somebody else? And the other 50% of the benefit, of course, comes from calling Pete. So that's the other 50% of the benefit of this question. Next, how have I addressed all the ways this could fail? So think about the email. What ways might it fail? Well, what if there's currently, an outbreak in the area, a serious COVID surge in the area where your client is, and then their kids' schools closed down, and they have restrictions that they're essential businesses only and be open, so they have to work from home, and various other issues that they're experiencing. Well, they're probably pissed and they're distracted by their kids. So read the draft of the email as though you're in a negative mood and likely to interpret anything in a negative way, especially stuff that tries to persuade and influence you, and as though you're distracted. And address any concerns about hostile interpretations and distractions in advance, draw the person's attention to the most important parts of the email, and so on. Finally, what new information would cause me to change my decision? What would cause you to revise your interpretation, change your mind about whatever you're deciding? For example, with the email, you can set a timeline. You could say, hey, if my client doesn't respond in a week, then I'll give the client a call. So that's a clear decision-making revision point. You know what you're going to do. You have a clear set point, and then you go ahead and do that. Now, otherwise, you'll just kind of ruminate and have anxiety about, well, why isn't the person emailing me back? What's going on? What should I do about this? You don't need to worry about it. You know that whenever that thought comes into your mind, you have a decision point in 7 days. And the same applies to any other daily decision that you do. You can have some information that triggers your decision. So if you get an email back with certain information, here's what you will do. Or again, with anything that you are making a daily decision on. So if you're setting up the new division of your company for the DoD, if you found out, I know there's a new Department of Defense secretary appointed today. If your intention was to set up a division that would be more targeted toward the previous perceptions of who would be the Department of Defense secretary, that would certainly change your mind. But that's an example. Of course, your experience may vary. So this process is great to do for an individual, for any leader in your organization, any manager, anyone who has external contact with customers. So this is great for sales folks to think about their emails as before their meetings, before their phone calls and emails to customers. your managers, yourself, your C-suite, and to also make a team decision. So if you're going for a team decision-making process, what you want to do is, before people come into the room to make a decision, you want everyone to, on their own, answer these 5 questions. So have them write out, sentence or two on each question. Take them, a couple of minutes to go through them, write out each question, and then come to the room and structure the agenda of the decision-making meeting along these 5 points. Then just have people share their perspective on number 1 and so on, and discuss it and address all the concerns, what are the issues, and go through it one by one. You'll be much more confident about the quality of the decision because you're using clear, structured, effective decision-making process. And I can guarantee, my clients have found that their meetings go about 60% more quickly, their decision-making meetings. They don't go meandering into, this point is something we should think about. Well, this point is something we should think about. This point is something we should think about. No, these are clearly 5 questions. You're going to go through them, you're going to decide, and you're going to go forward. So this is a really effective process for those daily decisions that you make by yourself, that your team, that your employees make, or you want to make as a team that's not crucial. All right. I want to see if there are any questions about this. So Scott asks if we end up with, and this is, by the way, a fine time to ask questions. So I want you to ask questions about the method. So there are 2 questions I see so far. If we end up with a really long email, no, of course not. Like the 4th question, how have I addressed all the ways this could fail? If you want to attract person's attention to the most important part of the email, you'll definitely want it to be short. Now, something you can do is you can have a short executive summary part of the email and then have a longer part, below it and say, hey, if you want to look at justifications, here's some of the reasoning.
That makes sense.
That's a way of doing it. So that's a way of approaching these sorts of things. Gordon asks, why are you calling these 5 questions to avoid disasters? Shouldn't you call these 5 important questions? Well, because I want to speak to people's emotions. 5 important questions doesn't speak to people's emotions. And again, we make our decisions based on emotions. These are the 5 questions you want to ask if you don't want a disaster with your decision. I want to clarify, this is not about making the perfect decision. Again, this is not about making the perfect decision. This is about making good enough decisions. Why it only takes a couple of minutes and just should go through these quickly. They avoid disasters in your decision. You might not make the perfect decision, but for the vast majority of your daily decisions, you don't need a perfect decision. You just need a good enough decision, and that's fine. And that'll address you don't need the perfect email. You don't need to spend hours on most emails. The large majority of emails, you don't need to spend hours writing them out. It's only for super important emails that you really want to write a draft, give it to somebody who has a negative perspective, pessimistic perspective, get their feedback, and maybe sleep on it or something like that. Super important emails. That's not the vast majority of your emails. Scott, yes, good enough is an excellent point. This is the method for good enough questions. That's why it's called the 5 questions to avoid a disaster. It's good enough. You don't need anything else. All right, other questions on this before we have a discussion about this as part of a group discussion? All right, so I want to take about just under 10 minutes to have a group discussion about how would your company be different if you used this for daily decisions. If your salespeople use this for daily decisions, if you use this, if your executive team, if your managers, anyone who has influential decisions in your company use this for daily decisions and for daily team decisions as well. So how would your company be different if you use that for daily decisions? All right. So I'm going to open the rooms, and then again, you'll have an opportunity to, you'll just press on the rooms, so, and then you'll go into them, all right? You should now see on your screen the opportunity to join a breakout room. So please go ahead, join the breakout room and have the discussion. Okay. Oh, Jeff, you're in a full call. Okay, good. You're not having technical difficulties. Excellent.
But I think that's an important aspect of this, is to consider the recipient of this and as you address it.
Yeah, for me, it's always about tone. How does it come off and how will it be received? Yes. Because what I'm trying to convey and how it could be received can be very different. So that's why it's important for me to have other people read it first.
Yeah,
I
agree that email is such a terrible way to communicate that you can't tell tone sometimes.
Right.
It's just how that person perceives it. They think you're yelling at them or being condescending, but you're really not. In your mind, you're just trying to relay some information, but it comes across completely different than you intended.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of times it's better just to pick up the phone.
Yeah, agreed.
But I will say, by doing email, one, it's allowed me to calm down and think about it, because it takes me a while to compose an email instead of just picking up the phone and saying what's on my mind. So, and by passing it through the two people I pass it through, a lot of times, even before I hit send to them, I look at it and go, is it really as bad as I'm making it out to be? Does this need this type of response? So they're all blessings to emails. It creates a record, and that's one thing I like about emails and email responses. Yeah. But I agree with you on the tone is absolutely atrocious. So I try to follow it up with an in-person phone call, but I at least want to have a record that we had this discussion.
Yeah, no, that's very true. You know, I almost fell into this morning right before I got on Vistage. I saw that somebody hired somebody after we agreed that we were not doing any hiring right this minute. We were going to wait till after the first of the year, but they went ahead and hired somebody without my knowledge. And I was going to light them up. And instead I said, you know what? I should just wait, calm down, and I'm going to talk to them later, and I'll just bring it up and see what they say. So yeah, sometimes time is your friend.
Mm-hmm.
On my whiteboard in my office, I wrote in big letters, authenticity can be ruined by a critical delivery method. And so I always have to wait and see how, whatever I want to really genuinely say to somebody, take the time to not deliver it in a way that could be perceived as critical. And some people are more sensitive, and I tend to be a little bit more, not insensitive, but just, you know,
some people don't have a direct communication style. They think you're being too aggressive if you're being direct.
Correct.
There's a difference between, when you look at the research, between people who tend to be task-oriented and others who tend to be people-oriented. Right. Those in leadership positions, like ourselves, tend to be task-oriented. And many others tend to be people-oriented, who are our employees, especially kind of in HR positions and so on, often in sales positions. But those are going to be people-oriented folks who are relational rather than accomplishing, task-oriented. So it's something to think about how they orient versus how you orient. And this is one of those kind of communication illusion of transparency issues, where the message that we're trying to get across is about a task, whereas what they hear is about people. They're feeling attacked and rejected because you're talking, because of their perception of the tone of your voice and their sense of you as a person and them as a person, whereas you're really trying to get a task accomplished.
Yeah.
So Jeff, I was curious, when the person was hired, it was probably someone who was more aligned with what your team was currently like, rather than what you would like the team to be more diverse in on a variety of categories. Am I correct?
No, it really just had to do with the bottom line. Like we
Okay.
have, it was strictly about bottom line.
Okay.
And we have obviously set targets for margins.
Mhm.
And by adding this extra person, they're going to, unless they bring in new work that we're unaware of, they're not going to meet their margin targets. So
I see. Mhm.
Yeah,
And
the person, I
bringing
think-
them on at the end of the year is another percentage hit because you pay unemployment taxes on the first few dollars and then turn around next year and you do it all over again.
Yes, exactly.
It's
Mhm.
just a pain.
Win the work first, then hire.
Yeah.
Makes sense. So yeah, then an approach to ask them about this is what their decision-making process was in going through this, kind of rather than lighting into them, which is definitely very tempting, but kind of how do they approach this decision? And then you can perhaps consider coaching them on how to make better decisions and what their concerns are and what the consequences are. I'm curious what you think about that. And this 5-question method can, of course, help them make better decisions in the future.
Yeah, no, I know how the decision was made. Well, I assume I know. I think this person is also a CEO of this other company
Mhm.
that we're transferring a bunch of work to.
Mhm.
And the VP that's in charge of that work, he has a history of overstaffing every project.
Mhm.
I think he does not ever want to fail or let down his client. So his solution is we will just overstaff it and then we'll always be on target, but we'll be over budget.
Mm.
So trying to get that balance is very difficult.
Mhm. Understood. Yeah, no, that is about, I'm not sure if it's the decision-making process, but it's definitely the cognitive bias of the planning fallacy and pessimism. So where they're not really thinking about the budget when they're planning and they're being too pessimistic about what they can accomplish. So that is a decision-making error that kind of what's, I guess I was asking more to get at the root cause of this. What is the person's challenge? Why are they making poor decisions? Kind of, it's a systematic issue that's especially good to recognize and understand, because then you can, if you correct the systematic issue in how the person makes decisions, you can address a lot of consequent problems rather than treat this as a one-off.
Yes. Yeah,
So that's
no, I will certainly bring these questions up.
Mhm. One more minute and then we're gonna get into the main session. So please go ahead, finish up the discussions.
Okay.
In January.
Thank you.
Happy holidays,
You
Marco.
too. Yes, happy holidays. Hope everyone enjoys it.
Yeah, you too.
Just so you know, Marco, I'll tell you a story about my kid. So yesterday, we get an email from
about a
the
minute,
school.
everyone, just letting you know, about a minute. But go ahead, please.
Got an email from my kid's school. This is my senior in high school. It's like, hey, he didn't show up for class. And we were pretty sure he was in there. And we went up and was like, were you in class this morning? And he's like, yeah. It ends up he fell asleep.
On camera?
Yeah. I'm not sure if he's on camera or not. And he's not the first kid in my household to do this either.
Oh,
Like, Sleeping through classes have become a problem.
Man. Looking forward to days when they go back to class.
Yeah,
that'll be nice. Yep.
Yep.
I think we have almost everyone back. Just one more person left. Okay, great. So everyone's back. I'd like to hear about your insights around using these questions. Of how would your company be different if your team members use this 5 questions to make decisions, and also if your teams use these questions for daily decisions and or. Please go ahead. What are your thoughts? What were your insights? What did you discuss?
For me, question number 3, if everybody instituted that approach, we would have a lot less emotional upheaval, because people don't really have, someone look at the tone. It's not so much the content. Frequently, it's the tone can be misconstrued via email. And if you had somebody else just read your message before it went out, it would avoid a lot of unnecessary angst.
Thank you. Definitely, yes. So having someone, especially with an different perspective than you, different thinking style, like we're talking about, would definitely be helpful. Thank you. Other folks?
Hey, this is Jeff.
We talked about is communicating the message about the decision and considering the audience. And that could be a factor of some of these questions. Are we using good judgment in how we're communicating the decision to others as well?
Excellent. And that's definitely part of the 5 questions. How can you communicate the decision effectively? Thank you, Scott. And Jeff, you want to share as well?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think going through just the exercise of asking yourself these 5 questions will make you slow down a bit. Email is so quick, you can fire off an email in a matter of seconds. So it'll make you slow down, be a little more thoughtful, and take some of the emotion out of it. I am one that subscribes to the ready, fire, aim methodology, and it blows up in my face quite often. So if I would just pause, run through these 5 questions, I think it would be very helpful to me personally, just to slow down.
Excellent. Glad to hear that, Jeff. Brad, I was curious. So we talked a little bit earlier about the decision-making, how you sometimes struggle with gathering sufficient information for making a decision. You kind of tend to gather too much. Do you think these 5 questions can be helpful in more of those daily decisions that you're making?
Yeah, I think they would be. I think the trick, at least for me, is to do them quickly. So like to go through them, use them for what they, help me with, but don't cause them to, if they create another rabbit hole for me to follow, then it's counterproductive. So like I would need to have some discipline about going through them quickly and only giving them the time that, if it's a small decision, I can only give a small amount of time to it. I mean, if it's a big decision, then yes, then I can go down the rabbit hole, but to have some discipline around that so it helps but doesn't delay the decision or cause me to think about that decision when I should be thinking about 4 other things instead. So
makes sense. One thing to think about is using a timer for each of the questions. So setting a timer for, 30 seconds or a minute for each question, and making sure that you don't go beyond the timer unless you discover something that really, your email needs to be rewritten. Obviously, that's something that you need to discover and address. Excellent. Good. So I'm curious, let's take a look at the poll. So this will be a poll about this method. How much value do you see in your team using the defend your future technique? Oh no, this is not this poll. Sorry about that. Hold on. The 5 questions. How much value do you see in your team using the 5 questions method for daily decisions? Yourself, your team. Please go ahead. Okay, so I see 60% voted, 6 out of 10. Great. Okay, one more person. All right. Excellent. So everyone sees some value in it. That's excellent. Some of you see moderate, half of you see moderate value in it, and half of you see high value in it. So great. So if you see moderate value in it, that's something to just kind of discuss with your team. Start using it yourself, of course, and then kind of discuss with your team as something to your leadership team, bring it in, say, hey, what are your thoughts? If you see high value in it, that's much more a priority to institute it quickly. So make sure to get it into your team, of course, yourself using it, but also get your team quickly using it and spread it through the organization. All right, great. And then I will talk about a bigger method. So of course, this is a quick method for daily decisions. This is a bigger method for more strategic decisions. I know a number of you are having important strategic decisions, whether about staffing up, whether about creating another department, whether about how to handle the heating up competition, kind of strategy questions. How do you address effectively strategy questions? And this is a technique called Defend Your Future. So this will take about an hour or more to do, depending, of course, on the nature of the decision. And it involves 8 steps. First of all, you decide on the scope and the goals of the question. You can do this for your whole strategic plan for your organization for the next 5 years. Use this technique to do your whole strategic plan. In fact, that's something I'm doing in February for a medical health company. So for a whole strategic plan, or you can narrow it down to a more targeted question, like setting up the DoD department, for example, or the new CRM or anything like that. So the area, the scope that you want to do, the strategic goals. So here, what are your goals? What do you want to accomplish? Why are you setting up the DoD department? Why are you ramping up your staffing? How do you see the consequences of your actions being beneficial for you? So that broad vision, that strategy. Then the timeline, 6 months to 5 years. So some kind of timeline. Don't really use this beyond the 5-year mark. There's extensive research showing that we tend to greatly underestimate the kind of changes that happen in the modern world, whether it's the pandemic or anything else. So you really don't want to go beyond the 5-year mark. And for longer timelines, you need to realize that you'll have less accuracy. 6 months, you'll have much more accuracy than 60 months. So this is the time to include more resources in your plan to address uncertainty, because you don't know what's going to happen, so you need more resources to address it. So first step, you gather your stakeholders. Whoever the stakeholders are in the decision, ideally 4 to 6, no more than 10. Had this happen. I had a corporation with 500 employees that I was doing a strategic pivot for COVID-19 on in September, and they wanted to have their whole, not simply the executive team of 6 people. They wanted to have their next level and have about 25 people in the room. That's not realistic. You don't want to have, we negotiated to have the C-suite and 2 more people. So that was 8 people, that's okay. But you don't want to have more than 10 people in the room, ideally 4 to 6. You want a balance of expertise and authority. So if it's someone, if you're setting up the DoD department, you don't only want the top people, you also want the people who'll be directly working and have the expertise in your organization on Department of Defense issues. So someone, they might be lower level, but they have expertise. And of course, people who have authority to make decisions. You want to consider recruiting an independent facilitator. You can recruit Pete, that's your Vistage chair. Maybe one of your Vistage member peers would want to volunteer. Maybe somebody else who would be an effective facilitator. If you're doing the CRM, one of the consultants, of course. Then what's your anticipated future? What do you feel will happen? What's, if everything goes as you envision, as it feels it should, what will happen? So without major changes, without any issues, setting up the DoD, staffing up, all of these issues, what would happen? And then how many resources you'd require. And this resources applies to money, time, information resources, social capital, so connections, strategic planning resources, so all sorts of resources. And you want to define what the resources are. Ideally, you can boil them down into money, although social capital doesn't boil down into money as well. So that's the kind of thing you want to do. So anticipated future, that's the 3rd step. Next, unanticipated problems. So here you're thinking about what can go wrong. That's a much more expanded version of the question of, how would you address failures? You want to write out potential problems anonymously. I had, as part of a strategic planning on product launch that I was facilitating, I had one of the people anonymously write that the product launch will fail because the VP of operations hates the guts of the VP of sales. Not great, and that's something that you really would not necessarily be not very unlikely to be heard out loud in an actual strategy meeting. That's why you want problems to be written out anonymously. So you can bring out politically problematic problems, tensions, issues, maybe get at things like, we're only hiring people who look like us, people who might be uncomfortable having that discussion. They might be willing to share more anonymously about their challenges with planning to not hire different people or something like that. Estimate the likelihood and the impact of each. What's the probability that a certain problem will happen? What is the impact of this problem if it does occur? Determine what are the most serious ones. Some are going to be not very serious, some are going to be very serious. So if you're setting up the DoD department causes serious conflict of interest issues of some sort with your existing clients, you definitely want to know that, and you want to estimate the likelihood of that and how they impact your business. Brainstorm solutions. So here's the time you got the problems out. Now it's the brainstorming time, especially good for optimists, to make sure to have some optimists in the room. And then identify what resources you'll need to resolve the problem. We talked about time, money, whatever, all the resources, strategic planning, social capital. And then you want to update your plan. So with this info, what kind of resources would you need to solve this problem? Then unanticipated opportunities. You don't want to only look for problems. You want to look for how to make this a success. Again, write out potential opportunities anonymously. So for example, this didn't need to be anonymous, but an example of a opportunity that was happening at the strategic retreat that I mentioned for this 500 employee company. This was a company that it's a SaaS company, so software as a service. And what it was finding was that as it was pivoting for the pandemic, its competitors were not pivoting nearly as much. So it decided that one of the things it would do for the pandemic is to make sure to target its software, which was around various effective ways of engaging in sales. So that's kind of a sales engagement software, and create a pivot package for its customers. So customers who are using its software for sales. And that way the pivot package would be something that would be a great opportunity for them to attract more customers who want to address the pandemic in their sales. And it turned out to be the case. This was a great opportunity. They changed their marketing, their sales. They got a lot more customers. They won some important accounts from Salesforce and other software that they were previously using. Determine what are the most promising ones and brainstorm ideas of how to bring them to life. So that's kind of what we're talking about in the strategic retreat, about the specific aspects of the pivot package that they can offer to their customers. Then identify the resources needed to address this opportunity and update your strategic plan. Next, what are the dangerous judgment errors? So you want to check for these relevant cognitive biases. You know them right now. Use the assessment. If there's no opportunity to use the assessment for some reason, you want to check for the most common ones that are relevant to strategic planning around any major project or for your company as a whole, major initiative. Loss aversion. We tend to be more averse to losses than we want to pursue gains. That's irrational because kind of increasing our bottom line or decreasing it by the same amount is still going to be the same bottom line, but we tend to be more avoidant of losses, like that manager who Jeff was talking about in the breakout room about who didn't want any project to fail, so they overstaff it and then they end up losing money, but at least the project doesn't fail. Then the status quo bias. We tend to be very attached to what we have right now. So if we want to hire the same people who look like us, who think like us, we want to keep the same organizational structure even when it's a bad idea and we need to pivot for the pandemic or anything else. Confirmation bias, we talked about that. Attentional bias, we tend to pay attention to what's most emotionally salient in our environment. So when we look at making a strategic plan, we tend to look at the existing trend lines. What are things going right now? and say, okay, let's just extend these into the future. That's where the future will be. That's not great. First of all, the future will be much more likely to be disrupted than you think. That's one. Second, you might not want to proceed along the same path. If you're looking at, let's say, increasing competition, increasing competition, lumber company, all of that, you might want to instead go to a different area that would, maybe you want to increase the sales that you're getting from the Rocky Road flavors from 20% to 40% and face less competition there. I don't know if that's possible, but that's an example of where you can pivot your strategy, not simply continue along the same trend lines. Overconfidence bias, we talked about that. Optimism, pessimism, halo effect, and Horn's effect. These are the most common ones that harm major planning, the major strategic plans. Then, next, unknown unknowns, black swans. There's some things that you can anticipate, unanticipated problems that you can essentially say, okay, these are the kinds of problems that I don't inherently anticipate, but it can occur. So it can occur, there you go. And therefore, these are the resources that it will take to address it. But you want to also think about things that you're just not thinking about as disruptors, like the pandemic, possibility of a pandemic as a major disruptor, right? We weren't thinking about that, but that's obviously something that came around. And there are other things that we don't think about. Well, let's say a cyber attack. Of course, the cybersecurity company thinks about that, but this major cyber attack that holds your company up for ransomware. So many companies suffer that. You might not be thinking about this as a major issue, but it can definitely happen. Or even something as random and majorly impactful as a solar flare that brings down GPS systems and satellites and seriously harms our broadband and so on, communication. That can happen actually relatively easily anytime. And that's something to be prepared for. Just know what you're going to do so that's something that you can include into the strategic planning. Make sure to have it as part of your business continuity plan. So make sure to look at this not simply for you, but something that can disrupt your stakeholders. So like, let's say you're having supply chain issues. That's one of the companies here is. You want to be thinking about what can disrupt the issue, what can disrupt the situation for your key stakeholders, not simply you. If you have investors in your company who you're relying on for more funding, maybe they're going to have issues. I don't know. And decide on the resources you need to address these. This is where you want to add additional resources. So some black swan events you can imagine, you can think about, like a cyber attack because it happened to a buddy of yours, or a pandemic. Some you can't unless you find out that it's something that's happening. Those are what Donald Rumsfeld called the unknown unknowns. You can't plan for them, like a solar flare. If I didn't mention this, you probably would not have been thinking of this as an issue. And I'm sure there are some things that I'm not thinking about. So you want to add some more 40% to the black swan resources of whatever resource you decide to account for truly unknown unknowns, ones that you can't in any way anticipate. And you want to consider how to make your plans more resilient and flexible. So that will help you address black swans as well. And finally, communicate and take the next step. So that's the last step. Communicate to your key stakeholders. Again, my expertise is not simply in risk management, but in specifically how to overcome resistance, how to do change management. And I can tell you that communication is half the battle to effective overcoming of resistance. And it's not simply communicating that this is what we're going to do, but getting feedback from them, making people feel included, addressing their emotions. You want to make sure to address their emotions. There's narratives that you use to address their emotions. There's various nudges and neuroscience tools that you use to address their emotions and make them bought into your strategic initiative. So if you want to change the pattern of hiring for your company to make sure you're not hiring only the same people, you want to get extensive buy-in throughout the company and get people's emotions invested into that. And then you want to reserve the resources needed that you decided throughout this plan are going to be the resources. And take the next steps. All right, so I will, at this point, welcome your questions about this technique. So again, chat or unmute yourselves.
This is Scott. I'm struggling with the black swans, unknown unknowns. That one just hurts my head for some reason.
Okay.
Can you talk some more about planning for that?
Sure. So what you want to do is you want to look at your environment and see what resources can inform you about major disruptors. For example, Bill Gates has been talking for a long time about the possibility of a pandemic. And most folks have not been listening to him, which is why very few have actually effective business interruption insurance that address the pandemic. What business interruption insurance is, you might have learned in this pandemic, is essentially property insurance. It addresses property damage. You have to get a special rider on it to address pandemic and address other issues. So there are additional riders which you can get and which are available from insurance companies. But the vast majorities of businesses didn't have that. And so they didn't get any payouts from the property insurance, from the business interruption insurance. You want to be aware of that. You want to be aware of, hey, so that's another way of getting information about unanticipated major disruptors. What kind of riders are insurance companies offering that aren't currently part of your business interruption insurance, and evaluating those, because they're only going to offer riders for things that can damage you, and that you can take a look at those things. So you can look at thought leaders like Bill Gates, you can take a look at insurance companies, and there are other ways that you can discover information about unknown unknowns. And if you go, for example, the insurance route, you can see, okay, these are the riders that I may want to get. You don't need to get, obviously they're not going to sell you a pandemic rider right now, but these are the riders that I might want to get, that they're offering, I don't know, 20 other riders. And which of them are going to be worth it for me? Which of them are not going to be worth it for me? How many resources will I require for these riders? However many, many thousands of dollars you would require. And then decide, okay, these are some things that I'll get, some things that I won't get. Look at the probability of each scenario, look at how much it would impact you, and so on. So that's kind of an approach to it. And there are a number of approaches that you can do for that. You can, of course, incorporate that into your business continuity plan. How would you address a situation? So you don't need a pandemic rider in your insurance, but you can have a business continuity plan that addresses a situation like a solar flare or any other major unknown. And of course, like I said before, there are some things that you just can't imagine. You can't include them in your business continuity plan. So let's say if you reserved there was a recent strategic retreat that I led where we ended up reserving something like $90,000 for unknown unknowns for a 3-year strategic planning process for this company. Not too large of a company. I think it was about 40-ish employees. So that's why it was 90,000. And then you want to add 40% for things that you completely can't predict. So added 37.5 thousand to that and reserve that as cash in the bank to address these major disruptors, which obviously can occur. Some of that the company used up to buy some riders and their insurance. So that's the kind of thing that you want to do for unknown unknowns. Does that clarify things?
It does. Thank you. That's good.
You're very welcome. Okay. Other questions about this methodology? All right. So then we'll get into groups to discuss this. So I see it's 10:54. I'll give you 6 minutes because this is too long to discuss in a large. This is a large method. I'm going to get you into groups just to discuss how might your company benefit from using this methodology, and then we'll have reporting out to discuss this in more depth. So about 6 minutes to discuss this. Please go ahead. You'll be able to join right now.
Something aside for something so catastrophic that you can't imagine it. doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. I don't see I mean, if you've got reserves, that's fine, but coming into this, we didn't have anywhere near enough reserves to get through. If the government hadn't stepped up with the PPP, we'd be dead. If you get a solar flare and it knocks out all communication and all electricity grid for weeks or months at a time, we're dead. I mean, I don't see how you can plan. There's catastrophic events that are going to be so significant. There's no sense in planning for it because there's no life after it. It resets us all back so far that I don't know how you even pretend to go forth.
I agree.
There are definitely going to be some situations which are unquestionably going to be terrible, but there are going to be other situations which are not so terrible. So for example, as I mentioned, there are some companies which secured pandemic insurance and which got by fine without government support. And the government support was just, if they chose to take advantage of it, it was just a benefit. So that's a way to think about it and approach it and say, okay, there are some events like a solar flare that we can address if the solar flare is moderate and it knocks out communication for 2 weeks, for a month. Kind of, how can we manage? What are we going to do? What is the situation for that? If you don't have a plan, if you don't have that as part of your business continuity plan, that's going to be pretty difficult to manage. If you do have that as part of your business continuity plan, which there's no insurance for a solar flare, as far as I know, there might be, but there is something that you can put into your business continuity plan and decide, okay, this is what everyone's going to do. This is what are the next steps for a 1 month interruption in communication. And that doesn't have to be due to a solar flare, but can be due to a cyber attack or a major cyber attack on the US by Chinese government or something like that. What are you going to be doing?
Well, again, I spent my whole childhood crawling under my desk preparing for the nuclear attack, and all the preparations wouldn't have done squat for us if they had really had a nuclear attack. So it just, if there are things that we can control or truly affect the outcome, that's fine. But so many of these, we really can't affect the outcome. And the way we would devise a solution today will be very different than 6 months or a year from now. So we'd find ourselves constantly renewing plans as both technology. I mean, we were very blessed with the pandemic. We had just gone to a virtual setup. We had started getting everyone working so they could work remote, mostly between offices, but it worked just as well in houses where they had a good enough internet connection. But that was part of a continuity. That was a plan or a progression plan, not part of a disaster recovery plan. And if I had to say that if we had to reserve 2% or something for some other crazy plan, we would not have instituted that plan to get as far along as we were when the pandemic hit and we all found ourselves working remotely.
I'm glad that you lucked out, and there's no question that if you had—
I'm the luckiest guy I know.
No, that's great on that situation. If you have a nuclear attack directly striking Washington, D.C., of course, that's not going to survive. But if you have somebody in the Bethesda suburbs or something like that, you can definitely survive, and duck and cover will help you survive. Knowing that you should not stand by the window and look at the bright shining light is going to be definitely good for your survival. So this is what this strategy, the Black Swan specifically component, and this is one of, again, 8 steps, is meant for. It's meant to mitigate risks that are survivable, and there's a whole range between nuclear strike on you and nuclear strike 50 miles from you, which you can survive if you have risk mitigation strategies. So that's kind of the difference. Do you want to be in a situation where if you have a nuclear strike 50 miles from you, that you still survive? Or do you want to just, kind of not, let it all roll? So that's kind of the difference that I'm talking about. And that's what the specific step of 7 out of 8 steps is for.
Okay.
Okay, so continue the discussion. I'll jump into the other groups and we'll have 2 more minutes. All right?
No, thank you.
Excellent. And thank you for addressing it. I really like pushback. So this is great.
Give up and it's just easier to shut my doors. So I think having that resiliency in your culture is what you really, I think that's where you need to plan.
Yeah.
Is how
I think you're right. I think you're exactly right, Jeff. So the question is, how do you make that a part of the culture? How do you, I mean, I don't want to say, how do you train resiliency? How do you develop resiliency in your team? I mean, if you can do that, you're likely to be, you'll have a competitive advantage. I don't know whether or not you survive the Black Storm, the Black Swan event, but you certainly set up to deal with it more effectively than those that don't have resiliency baked into the culture. And particularly at the leadership team level, I think that's exactly right.
So one of the ways to bake resiliency into the culture, so if you look at the bottom of my screen, consider how to make plans more flexible and resilient, is to make this a part of a checklist. So anything that you do, any behaviors, any projects that you're engaging in that are, you want to take a little bit of time to make sure they don't fail, is to ask that question. How can we make this plan more flexible and resilient? Which is kind of the same question. And that is, by changing behaviors, you change thought patterns. There are 2 ways of changing thought patterns. You can change the stories that people tell themselves about whether they're resilient or not, or you can change behaviors. And so either of those ways will get you there. So you can either highlight the need for resilience and tell stories about the benefits of resilience. Here's how resilience saved their company or saved us some money or something like that. That's stories. The other way is behaviors, using checklists and other prompts, incentivizing people to be more resilient. So those are the ways that you would train up resiliency. We'll have 1 more minute to finish up. So, but I want to make sure to jump in about the question of resilience.
Thank you. Jeff, I would add, and the guys on the call, don't do your people's jobs for them. Stop doing their jobs. Let them struggle with growing into the role, and they'll develop resiliency, I think.
That makes sense. I like that approach.
All right, guys, I'll see you back in the room.
Wait for a few seconds for the rest to join, from people from the other room to join. Thank you, Gordon. Yes, that's a good point about what Rumsfeld said about the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. Appreciate you sharing that in the chat. So for those who want to check out the chat. All right. So I heard good discussions about resilience, catastrophic disasters in both groups. So please share your insights from the discussion.
One of the things we talked about in our group was just maintaining an appropriate cash reserve, and also making sure we've got plans that are flexible going into the future.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, and that's really important. You want to, going through this process, and again, I was showing an aspect of it, will help you know what the appropriate cash reserves are and other resources. So strategic planning, you can't, in the moment, you can't spend cash on developing effective business continuity plan, but you can spend cash on developing it beforehand, so you know what you need. Thank you. Good. Other folks.
We had a similar discussion, but our firm got very lucky in the fact that we had very little cash reserves, but had just spent what we had on remote communication, driving efficiency was the whole purpose of it. It turned out to be the cure for the pandemic, that we could, because we had driven the efficiency up and gotten people where they could work from different locations, that we were able to function from everyone working at home.
Mm-hmm.
But if I had said, no, we can't afford to upgrade the communications because we have to reserve something for an unknown, we would have been in a worse shape, because we were so close to the line as it was, but made that decision that we based more on, we need to get the efficiency up more than a black swan event that occurred.
So it sounds to me like, and I know we talked about this, of course, one of the fundamental questions of a company's survival and success is cash flow and cash reserves. And if there's a challenge in terms of cash reserves, it's something to think about the root causes of it. And some of these methods will help you go through the root causes, and you can have a strategic initiative to address cash flow concerns and cash reserve concerns to make sure, using this method and so on, that you address that underlying root cause issue, because that's a root cause issue, and you want to make sure to address root causes.
Yeah.
That's a fundamental survival issue for a company. Pandemic comes around, next major disruptor comes around, you might not benefit from virtual communication. So that's just something to be thinking about.
Correct.
Other folks. Comments, questions before going onward? Don't see any comments or questions. Let's do the poll on Defend Your Future. So how much value do you see in your team using the Defend Your Future technique to inform your planning process on any major initiative, your strategic planning, your initiative planning, on any initiative, on any approach? So please go ahead. Excellent. Good. Quick voting. Excellent. So we see that everyone would find some value in it, whether I think 1/5 of you would find high value in it, or just over 1/5, and 4/5 of you would find moderate value in it. So that's great. If you find high value, and that's something to really push out and institute throughout the company and any projects that you're especially right now involved in or are going to be involved in. If you find moderate value, and that's kind of a more medium-term project to share it with the leadership and get their thoughts on, get their take on it, show them how it works. I'll send you a manual if you want it on this process so you can share it around. Great. Okay. So coming to the ending, and I mentioned resources, so you can get additional free resources, which are paid for by Vistage, free coaching session with me on integrating these techniques into your organization. And this can be any aspect of things. If you want to focus on, let's say, looking at the DoD initiative and looking at cognitive biases, or using a Defend Your Future technique on it, or more broadly on how to address cognitive biases in your organization, how to institute the 5 questions, anything that you would find helpful. Then the assessment, I think you got that. I'll send it to you again in case you missed it. The decision aid and 5 questions. So this is something, a decision aid that you can use yourself. You can print out, have it by the computer whenever you're making decisions, to remind you to do that, like Jeff wanted, to make sure to before going for any email or any kind of virtual related decision, deciding who needs to be in a meeting or who doesn't, or what the meeting should be about. All of those sorts of things that you can make sure to have that in front of you, and that you can forward it to your team members. who you want to get into the 5 questions. The manual on defending your future. So this technique that you can use yourself and give it to your team members, make sure that they learn about it, that goes through much more depth through the materials, including 2 case studies. And 3 books. The 2 of my books, publishers allowed the use of these digital versions. Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, and Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic and the post-COVID recovery. All right, and right now you'll be able to see a poll. So please vote on whether you would like to get these post-presentation resources. Go ahead.
While you're polling during the break, I sent a note to my former the owner, although he's still there, and I said, oh, you know, we're listening to this guy, he's great. And he already bought your book online, and it's called The Truth Seeker's Handbook.
Yep, that's one of my books. Yep.
Yeah, he went through all your stuff, and he said, I already bought a book, very impressive, you know, guy, blah, blah, blah. So wonderful. I made a sale for you.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. And then, well, you'll have 2 free books, and you can send them forward if you were a voter. So yeah, so almost everyone wanted resources. I'll be happy to send it to you. So, okay, that's done. Great. Okay, now any other questions? Anything that you want to ask me and that before we wrap up?
I don't think so.
Scott, you're welcome. I'm glad this was helpful.
Very helpful.
Mhm.
Let's do a round of takeaways. Do you want to exit the screen, Gleb, so that we just have everybody's faces and we'll.
Yes. Hold on. Yep. Please go ahead, everyone.
All right. Jeff, what was your takeaway from today?
Gosh, to slow down, really think through before you make your decisions. Like I said, I subscribe to the Ready, Fire, Aim. So just kind of take your time, slow down a little bit. Don't act like my hair is on fire.
Okay.
Also, the strategy, I think, was very, very helpful. I think I'll be taking them up on some additional strategizing about long-term.
Cool, thank you. Neil, your takeaway from today.
Yep, I think it's important to figure out when to communicate or when to communicate more or less. I think, you know, I mentioned, I think sometimes I over communicate on certain things. So, but I think that at the end of the day, leveraging some of the tools and that Gleb pointed out would be great in terms of making sure we're not bringing too much opinion and subjectivity to the decision making as we think about our path forward.
Excellent.
Yulia, how about you?
I think for me, the key takeaway is managing your communication before it goes out, and asking questions. Those 5 questions were kind of a breakthrough for me.
I like
and
the
timely too.
Great, thank you. Brad, your takeaway.
My takeaway is really I'm going to try to use the tool for the 5 questions along with a timer. I really like that kind of idea to still go through it, but do it in an expedited way, a disciplined way, to make sure that I'm just hitting all the points before I move on.
Excellent.
Anne-Marie?
I would say being intentional about who I invite to meetings when looking at big decisions and making sure that there's a couple of pessimists in the room. I think that I tend to go with who I'm comfortable with, and that's not necessarily the right approach.
Cool. Paul Johnson?
Combination of using the negative people to find my problems in my thoughts and ideas. And I've got a few of those around, so I can draw on them, their expertise.
Good.
And just making sure I use my trusted advisors, especially for important communications. I've been doing it a lot more recently, but every once in a while I'm so tempted to send something out and not let someone look at it from an outside and go, maybe you should say this a little differently.
Very good, Paul.
Great.
Bruce, nice background.
Yeah, I redecorated this week. I hope you like it.
All right.
I need some more books though. Information bias is one we go back and forth on all the time. So I think information bias, and then question number 5, which is what new information would cause me to revisit this decision. So we do most of the other ones. That one I think needs to come up a little bit more often. So
Excellent.
Scott. Unmute, Scott.
I think the biggest one is the biases. That's something we really need to take a look at, and especially in how we do hiring, and also when we're going after new contracts and making decisions whether to submit a proposal or not.
Twice.
Take us home, Gordon.
Okay, so first turn left as you exit, and then make a sharp right. So then you'll be home shortly. So for me, it's again, I think it was just kind of rehearing the horn halo and some of the biases. It's those things, you know, I've always been reading or talking about some of those, but it's interesting to hear it from a different perspective, and it just shifted my mind a little bit. So thanks.
You're welcome.
So I appreciate the questions, some of the questions you put out there today, Dr. Gleb. The quality of the question determines the quality of the outcome, you guys. So now you have more questions by which to ask, depending on the context. So add these questions to your arsenal so you can make better decisions. Thank you for today. When you drop off, I still have the screen, right?
That's right. You'll have control as the host.
Okay.
All right, everyone. Glad it was helpful.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.